Hey, everybody. This is Nevin Gusak, your host of the Politically Homeless podcast. With me is my guest, Tim Starr. Tim Starr is a member of Conservatives for Ukraine. He is an author, he is a researcher, he has an extensive background in politics, particularly in libertarian movements. He's very, very strong on national security, and we coalesce and agree on issues primarily related to national defense, national security, as well as some historical topics as well. Even in our last show, there were even a few slivers of economic agreement that we had too as well. He kind of breaks with the standard libertarian traditions on trade and even the role of unions too as well in the American economy, which I really appreciated. So hello, Tim. How you doing today? And thanks for coming back to the show.
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me back. It's good to be here. We had a power outage earlier today, but thankfully the power came back on, so I can actually do this.
Oh, great. Well, happy to have you with us. So I've been quite busy, and you've been one of several promoters of my new Substack newsletter called Wilderness of Mirrors, which is going to be taking an approach and addresses issues related to history as well as current events, economics, geopolitics, and history from the past. And you have read a number of my pieces. It seems like all of my pieces. And the pieces that I've written have been dealing with the various splits in the communist world, and some of it is relevant today in regards to, for example, the question of Egypt as whether it's an ally of the United States, and especially, of course, most importantly, China and Russia. And I know you've been pretty much read all my pieces, so I wanted to just kind of get your review and input on that. And then we're going to talk about the weaknesses and strengths of the Trump, Vance, and Harris and Walz campaigns regarding national security issues, and that will be our other topic. So could you give me some impressions, some, strengths, weaknesses, even critiques of my essays, particularly the most recent ones that you read regarding the various splits in the world and in between totalitarian states? And I have more in the pipeline too as well, which I'll discuss later.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of things that I really like about them. I'll just mention specific ones as I, come across them. But just sort of overall interpretation-wise, I have just been struck for a long time about how a lot of conventional or more conventional, shall we say, historians of the Cold War, and I just finished, a brand new history of the Cold War, To Rule the World by Sergei Radchenko. I liked it, but I found it a lot more flawed than your works in its interpretation. So there's a couple of obvious interpretations that I see of, the various supposed splits in the Cold War, and I think, some of them are more real or long-lasting than others. So I don't want to dismiss the theory that there ever were any splits. Clearly, there were some. I don't think they're all completely bogus, but how significant they are, I think there's a lot of room for debate. But one obvious interpretation that I've kept thinking to myself as I was reading Radchenko's book and not when I was reading yours, as a criticism, is the whole notion that different communist countries could play a variation of the old game of good cop, bad cop with each other, right? So the good cop is the one that's, they're both interrogating the same suspect. The good cop's being nice to them, the bad cop's being mean. It seems pretty clear to me that, Russia and China and other countries as well, played either the United States or other countries off against each other this way. And it's almost like if you have a child who wants to get permission to do something from their parents, and they think one parent won't give them that permission, so they go to the other parent, and they maybe they don't think that parent will either, but they tell, parent number one, well, parent number two said I could, so is it okay? And they're hoping that the first parent will say, well, if it's okay with your other parent, then I guess it's okay with me too. Obviously in Cold War diplomacy, it wasn't so much of a matter of countries asking permission from each other, but they're looking to get something else out of it. I guess one big thought that occurred to me as I was reading the one about the Sino-Soviet split was that I saw a talk recently by somebody else about the Cold War, who's trying to explain the various strategies that were employed in it, and various explanations of why the Soviet Union collapsed to the extent that it did. And one of the things she mentioned in there is that early on in the Eisenhower administration, U.S. grand strategy for the Soviet Union was to isolate them as much as possible in trade, so that the only country that they would really be able to trade with would be China, which had been, of course, conquered by Mao by that time. And I just kept coming back to that thought as I was reading about the Sino-Soviet split and asking myself the question, how much of that, effort by China to use this split to, get recognition from the U.S., get some trade going with the U.S., how much of that was an effort by them to, help themselves and the Soviet Union to break out of this trade isolation? I really wonder about that. It's kind of funny. I've been curious about the Sino-Soviet split for a long time, decades. I once wandered into a communist bookstore in Berkeley, where I grew up, because it was one that was aligned with one of the Maoist parties, the Revolutionary Communist Party. They have a bookstore in Berkeley in a city-owned parking garage. Last I checked, it's still there. So I wandered in there because I was hoping they'd have a book about the Sino-Soviet split, so I could find out what the Maoist perspective was on that. What did they say about the Soviets? And I found nothing. The only topics they had on their bookshelves were all about the usual sort of left liberal issues: environmentalism, racism, feminism, etc. Helping the poor, downtrodden, oppressed non-white male masses of the world. Didn't see anything about gay rights in there, oddly enough, but I didn't look too hard. So I still think it's a topic that is underemphasized in the historical literature that I've read on the Cold War, and I've read quite a bit. So I liked that one quite a bit. I found that one quite interesting. I certainly didn't find anything wrong, with your interpretation of it, really. And I'm not trying to flatter you here. If I think there's something wrong, I will tell you. So that one I liked quite a lot. I was also quite interested in the one about Yugoslavia and Tito, because I'd always heard the standard line, which is that, there was a split between Tito and Stalin, and ever since then, Yugoslavia was independent and never really had anything to do with the Soviet Union. But on the other hand, I remember when I first read Modern Times by Paul Johnson, his history of the 20th century, he talked a lot about Yugoslavia's involvement with the non-aligned movement. And somewhere, I can't remember if it was Johnson or somewhere else, I came across, the joke being that non-aligned meant Soviet aligned. And then Yugoslavia, made all kinds of money exporting weapons to the third world, and, sponsoring all sorts of, national liberations, armed struggles, and terrorist movements all over the world. So that's another thing I really appreciated about reading your article on that. And it also made me realize that I think there's another big underemphasis in Cold War history on terrorism and the sponsorship of it. I'm not really sure why, but it seems like conventional historians think that the only source material they're allowed to use is official documents that have been released from the foreign ministry or the State Department of whatever country they're writing about, whatever countries are involved. And there's all this other evidence that those countries try to keep secret, but a lot of it gets out anyway. And for instance, an obvious case is defector testimony. What did the defectors from these countries say about the countries they left that is verifiable in any way? And a lot of the conventional Cold War history I read just doesn't say anything about that. They don't even mention any of these defectors, and it seems obvious as an oversight. Why wouldn't they? So I think that if you include that type of evidence, you get a more complete picture of what's really going on, and that tells you a lot more about what these alignments really are, and what people are really trying to achieve, what what actual teams they're playing on are. So it seems pretty clear to me that from what you're writing about Yugoslavia there, that certainly shortly after Stalin's death, Yugoslavia and the Soviets and China were pretty much all playing on the same team again. Although this leads me to another interpretive metaphor that I thought of just today, really, which is that I think a lot of these, splits, or, Radchenko calls it competition between mainly China and the Soviets. To me, it strikes me as a lot more like jockeying for position in a horse race than actually being in opposition to each other in any sort of fundamental way, meaning that they're all racing each other to try to reach the same place. Mm-hmm. And, at various times, they may think they might be able to one up each other or gain some sort of advantage over each other. Like one of the things that I was trying to figure out, I've also been reading, I've read a lot before, but I've been reading some more about, the Afghan-Soviet war. And China did help us out supporting the Afghans against the Soviets there. And I've been trying to figure out, why would they do that if they weren't really all that much opposed to each other? And it seems like, possibly it could be just because, China felt like Afghanistan was a bit more in their part of the world. Also, the Soviets may have felt like it wasn't all that important a territory to them. They obviously did fight pretty long and hard to try and keep it, but, I think they certainly could have afforded to lose it in terms of, like economic benefit that they were going to get from Afghanistan. I'm sure they would have liked to have kept it if they could, but I don't think just losing that territory alone was going to kill them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other metaphor that occurred to me as I was reading in a lot of these splits. It seems like they're not so much wanting to, switch sides, either in sort of a complete way or a permanent way, but a little backstabbing to try and get ahead of the other guy seemed like a perfectly plausible explanation for a lot of what happened.
Yeah, and I think that's a very fair interpretation, and I try to be kind of careful with my words too as well. I think the split or the tensions and differences that existed between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin was clearly fake and contrived, and I brought a lot of evidence. the split between Tito and Stalin was very real. However, what I found was pretty startling information that even under the surface there was still collaboration. So you could have deep theoretical chasms and disagreements and literally major backstabbing, as you and I both addressed, but at the same time collaboration against common enemy. I think the split between China and the Soviet Union, I think that there is a possibility it could have been contrived in a fake. There is some serious evidence, which I brought up. But I think the safer point to say is at best, it was vastly exaggerated by policymakers in the West, including over time in the United States, starting with the Nixon administration and extending all the way to the Bush administration. Why that's relevant today is because you had elements within the Trump administration, Stephen K. Bannon, for example, David Pine, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, even the late Dr. Peter Vincent Pry have argued that we should split Russia and China apart, do the reverse China card. So I think that piece that I wrote on the Sino-Soviet split, which I covered relations with Russia afterwards, including China's very real help with, on behalf of Russia against Ukraine. Clearly, they share common enemies. And I think we have to be very careful to over-exaggerate the differences, whether real or perceived. And I think there is a chance that during the middle to the latter part of the Cold War that the split might have been fake. Now, the split between Albania and the Soviet Union, that I believe was real. But again, there are pieces of evidence. I don't know if you had a chance to read that essay or not yet.
And not yet on that one.
Yeah, and I think again, the essay on Albania really shows that the split was somewhat exaggerated too as well. The trade between Albania and the Warsaw Pact countries continued after the split in 1960. You had some weird things going on too as well, like Albanian Sigurimi, which was the Directorate of State Security, their intelligence service. Albanian agents were being trained in Laos after it was taken over by the Soviets and the Vietnamese in the Pathet Lao at a school, the Samoy School, where Albanian agents were trained alongside Romanians, Cubans, Soviets, East Germans, Bulgarians, etc., on how to pose as Americans and being inserted into the United States and to pose as Americans. Now, this is Albania working with Laos, which was a satellite after the Pathet Lao took over in December of 1975. Laos was a satellite of the Soviet Union and Vietnam, and is still very close now with China, Russia, and Vietnam to this day. Major General Jan Šejna, who defected from Czechoslovakia, one of the highest level policy-making defectors ever to come to the West. He had written in We Will Bury You, his book, We Will Bury You, and he recalled that the Albanians in the 1950s, when Khrushchev and the Warsaw Pact were launching their dumping of drugs into the West and the rest of the non-communist world. And Albania wanted to be integrated with the Soviet Union and the rest of the Warsaw Pact. But the Soviets were like, no, you're going to become an independent drug agent. You're going to work independently. And this is right before the split in 1960 between Albania and the Soviet Union. And the Soviets provided all the equipment and the funding to the Albanians to develop their own drug production and drug networks. So why before the split, why did the Soviets want Albania to become independent? Why did they not go and do do it as a member of the Warsaw Pact. To me, it's like, what did they know? Are they like setting themselves up knowing that there was this split was going to happen, so Albania would have their own? I don't know. Next, Albania also, like all the communist countries, supported North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. After Vietnam reunified in was April 30th, 1975, and then officially in 1976, where North and South Vietnam were officially reunified. What happened is that the Albanians and the Vietnamese continued relations, even military, where they're exchanging military delegations, although the Albanian press never really gave too many details on what went on. Now, at the 1981 Congress of the Albanian Party of Labor, that was what the ruling communist party was known as, it mentioned a Yugoslav report of that Congress mentioned, and they were present. I mean, even though the Albanian and Yugoslav communist parties had bad relations after 1948, Yugoslavia and Albania never cut off two-way trade between the two countries. But I guess the Yugoslav reporters were there, and they noticed that they were wondering whether the Vietnamese, based on what went on, I guess, in the Congress, whether the Vietnamese were representing just themselves or somebody else. Now, who that somebody else was, that's implied that that's the Soviet Union. So was Vietnam being used as a cutout by the Soviets in the relations with Albania to keep the possible fiction of a split going? We don't know. And I have a lot more. Now, I covered this in my book, Gallitzin Vindicated, but now I have found even more new information, and that's why I redid these papers.
Yeah, and that made me think of another dynamic that I kept thinking about. Again, I was reading both your articles and also Radchenko's book, which is that, Radchenko's interpretation, he seems to treat these third world communist movements that come to power as being these sort of, internally generated, completely spontaneous things that just, happen. And then once they come to power, they go, running to either the Soviets or the Chinese saying, help us, we want to be on your team. And to me, that's just a completely unrealistic take on things. To take for example, Afghanistan, which I know quite a bit about. First the Soviets spent years and years sponsoring the Afghan Communist Party and its two main factions within the Afghan military. Then there's they have a coup, so there's a Communist Party-led coup by the military against the, I believe it was the president of Afghanistan.
Yes.
And I was reading some other take on this, so they're saying, oh, well, the Soviets didn't really want to invade Afghanistan. It's just that it was so chaotic there, and it was right on their border. And I'm like, they caused the chaos. It was their proxies that, implemented the coup and, started trying to collectivize everybody's land and terrorize everybody and start killing everybody. And, according to some versions of this that I've read, they felt like they had to invade because the guy who was the leader before they invaded was killing too many people too fast and provoking too much resistance. So, they wanted somebody in there that would move a little slower. But it's not like they didn't want the territory. It's not like they didn't want it to be communist. So I thought that, again, the extent to which, countries other than, the biggies, either the Soviets or the Chinese, but still in the communist camp, were proxies of one of the great powers, seems to be, not taken seriously enough by a lot of other historians. Whereas I think if you look at all the evidence, it's very clear that they obviously were. I picked Afghanistan because I think people are not as emotionally invested in it as, say, Vietnam. But Vietnam, it was pretty obvious looking back on all the evidence that the Viet Cong and then North Vietnam was absolutely a proxy, of either the Chinese or the Soviets or both, depending on what time period you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. The last split, and people can go on my Substack, go to Wilderness of Mirrors, and please subscribe. It's free content. Definitely donate if you're able to. I mean, a lot of this, it takes a lot of my time. A lot of this is a culmination of continuous research that I do, as well as for that 20 years of research. So please do so. And please spread the word. But again, it is free content because the information is very important people to access. Now, concerning the Romania-Soviet split, that was contrived, as you probably, if you have read the piece on that, for those in the audience that came across that paper that I wrote, the split and the issues between the Romanians, first the leadership under Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej and then Nicolae Ceausescu, it was basically contrived. The collaboration existed, and I document that in tremendous detail there. Now, concerning the Third World, the issues in the Third World, or as now they term it, the term is Global South, very much like the communist movement here in the United States. I've argued that that communism and any other form of totalitarian collectivism that thrives on legitimate problems that are not addressed by the host governments, combined with subversion and manipulation. And that's really provides the gasoline that lights the fire of revolution. And, we can't lose sight of that. But many of these revolutions from the start are led or manipulated by communists. In some cases, they're started by legitimate movements. Take South Africa, the African National Congress, which was formed in 1912, which was more of a militant civil rights group to fight for justice of the non-white South Africans. And they were colonized by the Communist Party of South Africa, which was Soviet funded, starting in the 1940s.
Right.
And so you have that happening. And then you have other forces, like, for example, as you said, the Viet Minh, which then became later took power in North Vietnam, was the Lao Dong Party, which translates from Vietnamese to the Vietnam Workers' Party, or the Workers' Party of Vietnam, which then became the Communist Party of Vietnam. Those all along were backed by the Soviets and the Chinese and the Warsaw Pact countries. I can give probably more details to bore the hell out of the audience, down to the type of guns that were sent by China, North Vietnam, and the Soviet Union, and East Germany and Czechoslovakia, and the same with the Viet Cong. They were all backed by them. Now, also from the Vietnamese communist documents, back when it was the Communist Party of Indochina, back when the French were running Indochina, and then later the Workers' Party of Vietnam, they talked about also creating their own Indochina Federation, essentially, of communist states, if you will. That was the ultimate goal of the Vietnamese, is to create that. Defectors, like a former Viet Cong member of the reunified puppet Vietnamese National Assembly, as well as other governmental defectors from reunified Vietnam, as well as the documents themselves. I'll be covering that in a paper in a series called Historical Myths of the Day, like the myth that Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist. No, he was a communist first and foremost. And communists can deploy nationalism and combine it with a sense of proletarian internationalism, which is the proper term they use. They can have both. And Ho Chi Minh was a true communist internationalist and a Vietnamese internationalist combined into one. And what happens invariably with these movements is that they will launch severe purges against actual nationalists, whether good nationalists or bad nationalists, or colonial collaborators, literally, as well as also dissident communists and other non-Soviet style, Stalinist style communists. And that happened in Vietnam. You look at, for example, the Viet Minh, as soon as they took Hanoi with the help of the Americans and the USS, by the way, in 1945, and they also had some relations with the Soviets too as well, two-way communications at bare minimum, as well as ties with the Chinese Communist Party, which was yet not controlling China. The Viet Minh severely purged people, their security police, in cooperation for a year and a half, even with the French. Purged the Dai Viet Party, the VQNDD, which is the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which is intimately tied in with the Chinese Kuomintang. They purged various religious sects like the Hao Hao and the Cao Dai. They purged Vietnamese Trotskyite communists. They did all sorts of manners of things. They severe purges, if you will. They wiped out virtually the entire Vietnamese nationalist movement that was independent of the Communist Party of Indochina. You know, the ANC in South Africa during the 1980s, they had a campaign to make South Africa ungovernable. And what they did through their fronts, like the UDF, the United Democratic Front, is they went after rival communists or socialist groups like AZAPO, the Azanian People's Organization, and BCM, the Black Consciousness Movement, as well as also black officials and police officers that collaborated with the National Party apartheid government, as well as also more liberal anti-apartheid organizations, as well as also, I forgot, also the Inkatha Freedom Party, led by Chief Buthelezi. So the ANC, they went after people all across the political spectrum, whether they were apartheid collaborationists, whether they were sort of centrist, or whether they were well on the left and advocating some sort of socialism that you and I would reject, but still were kind of in the wrong socialist gang, if you will, or political formation.
Yeah, they weren't in the right chain of command. Yeah,
exactly.
And that's another thing that I think struck me as I was reading through these. You know, to some extent, it was learning new stuff, and then to some extent, a bit of a refresher of my memory on a lot of these things. But I certainly recognized this sort of pose that a lot of these movements adopted, where they would try to make themselves presentable to the West, and they try to make themselves appealing to the West. And it actually put me in mind of a quote a friend of mine used to quote from Kipling, which I looked up so I could quote it here. So Rudyard Kipling wrote this about the Russians way back when. He said, "Let it be clearly understood that the Russian is a delightful person till he tucks in his shirt. As an Oriental, he's charming. It's only when he insists on being treated as the most easterly of Western peoples, instead of the most westerly of Easterns, that he becomes a racial anomaly extremely difficult to handle." And I just thought that sort of captured this sort of duality between the way that the Russians and others often try to present themselves. You know, they'll wear a suit and a tie, and they'll be clean cut and clean shaven, and they'll try to speak in a even-tempered fashion. Some more than others, of course. Khrushchev was given to bluster, but Putin is a lot more calm in his presentation most of the time. I don't think anyone's ever seen Putin banging his shoe on a table at the UN. But there's clearly a great extent to which this is, it's just it's a trick, it's an illusion, it's a pose that they put on. I grew up hearing the story that, Ho Chi Minh was just a nationalist and he just wanted Vietnam to be independent and he only had to turn to the Soviets because no one else would help him. And that's clearly just not true at all once you, get familiar with his full biography. He, for instance, he very pointedly sided with Stalin in the Tito-Stalin split. If he was just a nationalist, you would have expected him to take Tito's side there. But he definitely didn't. He was very, very clear about this. He survived Stalin's purge of the Comintern in the 1930s, where anybody that was suspected of the slightest bit of disloyalty was sent to the Gulag, if not killed. So yeah, that's another thing that really struck me reading a lot of this, and to bring it back to contemporary relevance again, I think this is very much the sort of way that really both Russia and China try to present themselves to us today. They don't appear in like traditional national costume. They wear suits and ties. They're clean cut, clean shaven, and it's not just mere physical appearance. China tries to pretend that they're the world's greatest friends of free trade, for instance, when I guarantee you they don't practice free trade with the rest of the world themselves. They care about being able to export their stuff to the rest of the world, but that's about it. And then Russia is always trying to say, well, we're we're just like America. We're a big continental empire. We have our legitimate sphere of influence. We have our security interests. That is something that I did think Radchenko got right in the book I just read, where he was presenting the Soviets as trying to play themselves off as being the equals of the United States in that way. And they just wanted to be accepted as equals with the United States, in the sense of both moral equivalence and, having the just as much right to do the sort of things that America does. But I don't think he did a very good job of showing how that equivalence was false. He alluded to it a little bit, saying, there's a difference between, having allies that are democratically elected and, want you to be their friend versus, allies who were not democratically elected but came to power via violence, and then want you to back them up. I think there's a big moral distinction to be made there, which he just alluded to, but he didn't really spend too much time developing that. So
yeah, what Radchenko is in, he does bring up good facts, like particularly on how Gorbachev was trying to effect a rapprochement with India and China simultaneously, and I incorporated some of that into my paper on the Sino-Soviet split. And Radchenko admits that it was to create an anti-American alliance, and I think it really confirms, our points that at bare minimum, even if you accept the Sino-Soviet split as real, and I think a part of me does, but I think it's definitely has been exaggerated to an nth degree, and there's still a possibility it could have been fake. That's my position, if you want to call it as such. And it shows, Radchenko basically shows that splits can be healed as quickly as relations can be broken or severely compromised or downgraded. And I think that's one of the strengths of his works is he uses the documentary sources, but I interpret some of the information a bit differently. And I think this is a problem that we have. We have these splits in the Middle East. There have been it splits within Iran, the Taliban, the notion of reformists within both groups. And I have an upcoming paper about that, actually. The reformists in Iran, like Khatami. Well, when you look at actually what Khatami says, as well as the actions of the government, it was more like Lenin under NEP. You still had the basic totalitarian superstructure in place and control mechanisms, but you kind of introduced these sort of private market mechanisms into the economy, and also continuing to spread communist revolution in the case of Lenin throughout the world, and in the case of Khatami, Islamic revolution throughout the world as well. And that's a big thing, and the issues of splits not only is irrelevant on Russia-China relations with what the elements within the Trump administration and certain Trump adjacent advisors and intellectuals and policy wonks have proposed. But also we have to take a look at Iran. We have to take a look maybe down the road at Taliban held Afghanistan, for example. We have to take a look at these as possibilities, maybe in Cuba. The talks about you'll have a new communist leader, maybe that will outlive Diaz-Canel, who will be more reformist. In fact, when Army General Raul Castro took over as de facto dictator of Cuba after Fidel Castro's death, I mean, they started to introduce more private mechanisms within the socialist order in Cuba, but the private micro businesses like the Paladares and enterprises of that nature are severely controlled by the state, and licenses have been withdrawn from them by the government too as well. And the difference is that it's all political there too as well. And the government has no checks and balances whatsoever on the exertion of law and regulation. There's nothing like that. So you look at that in Cuba, and there were talk of, hey, Cuba's reforming. But again, it's the same old wine in a new shiny bottle. And you talk about the suits and ties, that's an old trick. As you probably read that essay on the general essay I wrote about splits, and I talked about how under the era starting at about 1920, you had the Bolsheviks taking out of old trunks with mothballs in it all these top hats and suits and frock coats and everything. Why? Because they had to go to the West to entice greedy Western capitalists, including American businessmen, to invest in the Soviet Union and whatnot. Of course, you have to look like you want to do business. Somebody who is wearing a suit and tie and you're approaching a businessman, you want to look like them, like a colleague of theirs. You want to look collegial. Somebody who's going to be more comfortable dealing with you instead of wearing, a sort of stereotypical Bolshevik clothing with the cap and everything. No, you're going to come, you want to look like the businessman that you're dealing with. It gives a sense of collegiality and comfort, like, oh, they're a colleague, they're one of us. These are people we can do business with. The Nazis, as I pointed out, did the same thing too. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels spoke to various directors in his department in 1936. You may remember me bringing up that point. He said, guys, you should, to the party bigwigs, forget about your brown uniforms or your black uniforms and stuff like that. You can wear them, but wear the suits and the top hats and the frock coats and everything, because it doesn't make a difference whether you're wearing a brown uniform or a top hat. A revolutionary is a revolutionary in the heart of the person underneath the suit. And I think, this is what it is. And one thing with my study of totalitarian, collectivist, expansionist governments and movements is they're very strategic minded. They know how to do these controlled retreats, study the enemy, and then adjust their strategy and tactics accordingly so they can get what they want. And that's one of the effective aspects of whether Bolshevism or National Socialism, if you will. And I'm actually going to talk about, and then I'll let you comment, another piece on the splits in the world that I talked about, that I'll be issuing a paper soon, is the whole issue of moderates. And I want to get your opinion and some opinions on some Axis power stuff. The notion that the Nazis, the Japanese militarists, and the Italians, oh, they had their moderates. Oh, Italy privatized part of their economy under varying periods of fascism. Don't you know? Don't you see? Oh, we can do business with them. But of course, as I'll talk about, or that the Nazis, oh, they're a conservative country. Oh, they're capitalists. They actually propounded that actually selectively to the British, the French, and the Americans, and other countries. And the Nazis in their own newspapers and theoretical journals took a much more kind of cynical, opportunistic view about that. That was, a little sneak peek here on that to give you an idea of where they stood on some of these things. I think one was in Joseph Goebbels, back when he was a propaganda chief, not in government, he wrote in the Nationalsozialistische Mannschaft, which is one of their theoretical journals. And he wrote in 1930 about the Harzburg Front, which was their temporary united front with the German DNVP, which was the Nationalist Party, or what the Nazis viewed as the reactionary conservatives. He admitted that, quote, there can be absolutely no doubt that a deep ideological chasm yawns between us and them, meaning the reactionary conservatives. A fact that needs to be pointed out all the more clearly, the more often we are compelled to form alliances with bourgeois forces in order to attain our tactical goals. They are captives of their own bourgeois mindset. So another thing that was kind of interesting was this economic statement, if you will, and this was, let's see, in January 1940, the Rhine Front, which was one of their Nazi party journals, applauded how, quote, German socialism had, quote, broken down the resistance of conservatives. Germany has now created a kind of state economy while preserving private property, which is in fact a socialist economy, so all of this is just very, very interesting. Here's another one, Fritz Nonnenbruck, who was a former German communist writer who converted to National Socialism, wrote in the Völkischer Beobachter, which is their main newspaper, as you know, one of their main newspapers. He said that it is natural that foreigners should ask, what is this German socialism which has taken up the challenge flung down by Jewish capitalism? It is true that we in Germany have joint stock companies and pay dividends and have a Reichsbank and make use of gold. These are phenomena of capitalism, but the resemblances are superficial. So I have tons of quotes. That's a little sneak peek what I'm having the whole Axis powers. And, I know you're a scholar of World War II as well.
Right.
What is your impressions of what the Nazis are trying to say? Is it very similar to the same strategic deception and pragmatism of the Bolsheviks, even like China today and Vietnam today? What is your impression of these quotes before I ask some more questions?
Yeah, well, I think that's pretty much what I would generally say about that. Some specifics I would add is I've read how, for instance, the Nazis were able to control Hollywood movies production a good deal simply by putting out specifications for what sort of movies they would allow to be shown in Germany or not. So, for instance, the classic World War II movie Casablanca would never have been made before the war, because there's no way Hollywood would have been able to make as much money off of it, because they would have never had any chance of getting it shown in Germany. So Hollywood was self-censoring a lot before the war, just because they wanted to have their movies shown in German theaters and they wanted to make money off it. China's doing the same thing now. China, I think one of the most obvious examples that occurs to me is what about 20, 25 years ago, Richard Gere made a movie portraying the fate of a businessman in China that was, trying to start a, international television broadcast deal
Yes.
there. And can't remember what it's called. Was it Red Corner?
I think it was Red Carpet or something or another. Let me look it up while you talk.
Yeah, he gets in all sorts of trouble there, and it's either based on a true story or it's fairly realistic. But he's basically been blackballed by China ever since, and he's hardly made any movies since then. The only movie I can think of that he's made since then is he was in Chicago. But he basically can't get a job in films anymore because of China. And I'm sure that's, just one example out of many.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The movie is called Red Corner. Yeah. And I saw it. I remember Richard Gere was well known for anti-CCP activism because he is also a Buddhist too as well. There was a more recent example with Red Dawn. The remade version was supposed to cast China as the occupying force.
Yep, they had it to North Koreans.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, because China had a lot of power over the AMC studios. And you're right, it was very similar to how the German National Socialists, including through its resident consular officers in the United States in the 1930s and even into the very beginning of the early 1940s, they exercised tremendous control, even almost veto power, over American movie directors and film corporations, entertainment companies. Yep. Because they threatened the loss of the German film market to American producers.
Yeah, and China is one of the most lucrative film markets in the world right now. I know I even have read articles blaming the demise of dialogue in Hollywood movies on the fact that a lot of those movies are being made with a view towards the Chinese market, where they don't speak English, so they don't care about snappy, witty English language dialogue. They care about stuff that they can understand and enjoy without having to speak the language.
Right.
Another thought that occurred to me as you're asking about this is a more overall sort of grand strategy thing dealing with both the Nazis and the Soviets. I was just watching a talk because there's a new book out that, of course, I want to read about. It's called The Specter of War, and it's about how the threat of communist revolution was a big factor in the rise of fascism and the lead up to World War II. And in the talk, the author made a very interesting point, which seems obvious in retrospect, but I had never actually thought of it before. So he pointed out that normally you would have expected there to be a balance of power coalition forming against Nazi Germany a lot sooner than it did. But he argues that the main reason that did not happen was the threat of communist revolution. So the Nazis were able to play themselves off against the Soviets as, oh, we're the civilized Westerners, we're the business-like people, we're Christian, even though they weren't. all this sort of standard BS lying that they did back then, but they were able to get away with it because they had something to point to and say they're worse than us, And this is also something that occurred to me. I did a lot of reading about the America First Committee and the anti-interventionists before World War II, because a lot of libertarians, and I came out of the libertarian movement, and I still am a libertarian in a lot of ways, but not so much on foreign policy, at least their version of it. As I was reading this, they're quoting all of these leaders of the movement, and why they thought it was a bad idea to go to war against Nazi Germany. But it occurred to me, a lot of them, they weren't really, consistent, principled anti-interventionists across the board. They just thought that Germany was not the biggest threat. It was not the right enemy. They thought that the Soviets were the real bad guys, and that they were the ones we needed to prioritize. You can argue with that. I probably would, but I would not, say that they weren't a threat. But it wasn't like they were, oh, America should just keep to itself no matter what, all the time. It was pretty clear that a lot of these guys felt like, if the Soviets were the ones being focused on, that would be the right thing to do.
Yeah, and what were the positions of American libertarians before the Cold War on Nazi Germany? I'm not going to count Ludwig von Mises, which he wrote extensively about Nazi Germany, because he really wasn't American until he settled here by the 1940s. But what were their positions on Nazi Germany and our dealings with them, whether we should trade with them? I have really not found much information. I think the post-World War II libertarians, I think there is more of an anti-interventionist strain to them, while they're not theoretically pro-Nazi, if you will, calling for National Socialism as a political or economic system. There's this sort of almost benign view that they really did not have plans to conquer the United States or seek hegemony throughout the world. And in my discussion, my upcoming paper, which will come on the whole axis moderates versus radicals, I'm going to be talking about that and kind of hopefully trying to lay that to rest. What were the stances of libertarians before World War II? And maybe we need to even define the term libertarian, perhaps. It means different things to different people, perhaps. But what were their positions on Nazi Germany beforehand?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question, but I think I can't really answer it with a whole lot of specificity. I think that was not a very good period for there being much cohesiveness to any libertarian movement that there was at that time. I know one of the intellectual leaders at the time was Albert J. Nock, but he had been suckered into the World War I revisionism, and he wrote a book called Myth of a Guilty Nation, which I've never been able to find a copy of, but it's pretty clear that he's trying to absolve Germany of guilt for starting World War I. He referred to he and the few other libertarian intellectuals that he knew of at that time as the remnant, meaning they were practically extinct. I don't think there was a whole lot of coherent foreign policy thought at the time. I know certainly Ayn Rand was around, and she was, diehard anti-communist at the time. I know she never really had any sympathy for Nazism either. I don't think she's even ever been accused of that, really. Ludwig von Mises has wrongly been accused of sympathy for fascism, but that's a complete misinterpretation of what he wrote. And as you said, he wasn't even really American. He fled here from the Nazis because he was Jewish and completely opposed to their ideas, not just in economics. The more
Well, just everything. He's like the polar opposite of everything they stand for.
Yeah, the more coherent policy positions I've seen were the ones being advocated mainly by Murray Rothbard after World War II, where unfortunately he came under the influence of Nazi sympathizers like Harry Elmer Barnes and David Hogan. Barnes was one of the original World War I revisionists, and he ended up becoming a Holocaust denier before dying in the 60s. And then Hogan was a Barnes protege, and Rothbard knew Hogan and worked with him at the Volcker Fund. There's a line, Gary North worked there at the same time also, and Gary North wrote a sort of a memoir about their early days there, where he said, oh, this guy was very entertaining, and when he got drunk, he'd start defending Hitler. Well, he wrote a book-length defense of Hitler called The Enforced War, and then he later on wrote a Holocaust denial book called The Myth of the 6 Million. But they were basically arguing that Germany was forced into the war by Britain promising Poland, hey, Poland, if Germany attacks you, we'll defend you. And I don't really buy that as an excuse or a pretext. For a long time, really, I think there was a strong hawkish element in libertarian foreign policy thinking until, at least to the 60s, if not the 70s. A lot of libertarians back then came out of Young Americans for Freedom, YAF, which was very anti-communist. I think David Nolan, one of the founders of the Libertarian Party, wrote an article once about how a lot of the Marvel Comics superheroes were anti-communist, like Iron Man originally was also. So I don't think it's a real coherent foreign policy outlook until relatively after World War II. Certainly the dominant one today, I think, didn't really come together until the 70s at earliest, where they just decided on, Rothbard pretty much proclaimed that anti-interventionism was the only real libertarian foreign policy outlook. And I think kind of by default, since, the other parties were a lot more hawkish in one way or the other for the most part, that sort of anybody who identified with the Libertarian Party, thought that they needed to be a contrarian on foreign policy also. So I think a lot of them just fell into that. By now, I think a lot of them have really talked themselves into it and think it's, the only morally correct point of view. But I think they're gravely mistaken about that. But going back to your point here, I think it certainly there's a big aspect of which, the ability of these authoritarians or totalitarians to present themselves in an appealing fashion as these supposed moderates keeps suckering people time after time. I mean, for instance, I was astounded when people, 10 years ago or so, started talking about the Taliban having moderates. And I went, what? Moderate Taliban? I mean, this is the closest thing to a contradiction in terms that I can imagine. Just the whole, there's people that we can negotiate with. That's one thing that struck me reading Radchenko's book about the Cold War. And I don't want to blame him for this, but it just struck me as I was reading it that there seems to be this fetish for negotiations amongst Westerners. As Churchill rightly said, jaw, meaning, talking is better than war. And that's true, but I think that we end up getting played a lot by people who, are really our enemies and actively working against us in all sorts of ways. They fool us into thinking they're not because they keep saying, we're totally willing to negotiate with you. We'll have summits and we'll have meetings and we'll have talks. And, it sort of reminds me of the Israeli peace process where, or the negotiations that they've been having with Iran, where basically, the Palestinians or the Iranians just they're negotiating, but every time we ask them for something, they say no. And then we go, okay, and we come back with some other proposal, some other offer. You know, you know, I think it was the theory behind making Arafat the head of the Palestinian Authority is that supposedly he would crack down on Palestinian terrorism, and he never did. You know, and they kept saying, you know, okay, can we give you this, and you'll stop the terrorism. And he would, in Arafat's case, he would promise that he would do it, but he just wouldn't ever do it. And then I think with Iran, you know, it's all been about their nuclear program. You know, Obama kept saying, you know, well, what if we promise you this? Then will you stop your nuclear program? And they'd always say no. And then he'd come up with something else. Well, what if we promise you this other thing too? And they seem to have finally decided they would just unilaterally do all the things that they thought would get Iran to stop their nuclear program, in the hopes that even though Iran always said no, they would, you know, change their minds. But obviously they never did.
Yeah, and that's why this whole moderates versus radicals is so relevant. And that's why now, before we shift to the topics of the election, the presidential election, the items that I'm going to be talking about, some of them are going to be very short essays, some of them will be long. I'm going to be talking about the Khmer Rouge deception after they lost power in January 1979. I'm going to be talking about the whole issue of the goulash communism, or the moderate communism, of Janos Kadar and Karoli Groj, who was the Kadar's successor as General Secretary of the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. That's what the former ruling Communist Party was known as. We'll talk about how they still were committed adversaries of the West. I'm going to talk about the Czechoslovak liberalization of Alexander Dubček, kind of the two faces behind that. I'm going to talk about the quote-unquote national communism in Poland under its first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party, which was what the Communist Party was known as back then, Władysław Gomułka. I'm going to talk about the Eurocommunism and the two faces of that from the 1960s to the 1980s. And a lot of this is kind of proving Golitsyn more right than wrong. There are even some tensions between Cuba and the Soviet Union and China in the 1960s, and then again the tensions with the Soviet Union between that and Cuba. A very brief essay on that. I'm going to talk about also the manipulation and co-optation of dissidents by the ruling communist parties, you know, all the way until today, which is a age-old tradition in Russia of the Okhrana, which was the former Tsarist secret police intelligence agencies. The supposed tensions regarding the Soviet Union, North Korea, when the Soviets were starting to open up trade relations with South Korea, and the kind of two faces on that. Of course, I talk about the moderates versus radicals and amongst the Axis powers. And then, of course, last but not least is also the deception practices, the radicals and the moderates, in the Islamic camp in the Middle East, whether it's in Iran, whether it's with the Taliban, because yes, I've done research about that. You fall on the floor, just can't make this stuff up, as well as also the deceptions of the moderates versus radicals within the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization coalition, and even by the attempts of even Hamas to even make, quote, peace, or a hudna, which is in Islamic terms, an Islamic strategic practice, is a temporary truce, not a permanent truce like we love you kind of thing. And then, of course, how Iran and Iraq, I don't know if you're aware of this, and to close out my papers on the various fake or exaggerated splits, but there were periods where Iran and Iraq were close or did modus vivendi. Like, for example, Iraq, at least officially, welcomed Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution as a blow against the Shah. They were worried about, yes, the spread of Shia Islamist revolution, but they also openly welcomed it as a blow to U.S. imperialism in the region. They welcomed Iran's withdrawal from the Sento Treaty, for example, when the Ayatollah pulled them out in 1979. They welcomed that.
Right.
And then after the Iran-Iraq War was concluded, then by the time the Gulf War started in 1990, there were negotiations immediately after 1988 conclusion of the Iran-Iraq War to develop an alliance against the United States. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. And that there was actually, the Iranians helped the Iraqis in the 1990s smuggle oil throughout the world. And that there was still trade, and the trade redeveloped. And in fact, even the Iranians, Iran was sometimes a conduit for weapons as well as a refuge for the Iraqi Air Force fleeing to Iran. And Iran allowed them to do it. I mean, Iran could have told them, no, don't do it. But they did it because they have a common enemy of the United States. They also don't want to inflame Arab public opinion against Iran. So Iran does what Iran does best.
Yeah, I remember hearing about the Iraqi Air Force fleeing to Iran in the Gulf War. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The first Gulf War in 1990, 1991.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like there's a lot of things I do and don't know about Iran. So, for instance, I read an article by Claire Berlinski about the Cold War in the Middle East. And one of the things that she says is that the Iranian Revolution was originally Soviet sponsored. But then what happened was that there was I think it was an MI6 double agent from the KGB in Iran who defected, but he apparently got a list of all the communists in the Iranian Revolution and gave that to the Ayatollahs. The Ayatollah Khomeini was able to use that list to, get rid of all of them and, escape, at least temporarily, from the Soviet orbit. I've been trying to find something that fleshes out that story more, but I haven't really found anything I find satisfying yet. And then I think later on, clearly, by the 90s, it seems like Iran was pretty much aligned with Russia again. I think I was probably reading something of yours about that in the past several days. I was very interested in that. But then also, one of the sort of fake splits that I've thought about for a long time, I don't know if it's in your plans to cover, but you may or may not want to do so, is the supposed Shiite Sunni split. Because there's a lot of, we were told this a lot back in the early 2000s that, Al Qaeda is Sunni, so therefore they would never ever get any support from Iran because Iran is Shiite. And
I kind of not to interrupt, I kind of covered that in one of my essays on Substack a little bit. Actually, how Al Qaeda, we're told that Iraq could never back. Iraq was secular Sunni Muslim dominated under the Ba'athists, and that they could never collaborate with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood or Al Qaeda. Well, they did, and I pointed that out. I did point it out in my essay on splits in general. For a reference, while you continue, I apologize, but I'm very familiar.
I'm glad you interjected with that because I think that's very important to bear in mind these days. And to me, the other biggest existence proof refutation of this theory that Sunnis and Shiites would never collaborate is Hamas is Sunni, and Iran gives them like 95% of their funding. Iran is not Sunni, Iran is Shiite. Now that's been true for a long time. So, I was just reading something, where, the CIA was saying, oh, they would never collaborate, and then somebody finally forced them to take a fresh look at the evidence. Well, okay, yeah, they collaborated. I mean, come on. That's one of the things that sort of strikes me about a lot of this resistance to evidence of state sponsorship of terrorism. There's all of this evidence that's out there. I even read a history of the United States and terrorism by Timothy Naftali called Blind Spot, an ironic title in a lot of ways, where he's quoting people from back in the Reagan administration in the early 80s, where people on the one hand are saying, yes, the Soviets are sponsoring terrorism, and the people in the U.S. State Department are saying there's no evidence of that, there's no proof of that. There's just
Exactly.
there's been tons. I really don't understand this resistance to just look at the evidence and admit that it's real, it's there, it happens. This is how it works, folks. I mean, what was it? The IRA's weapon of choice, Semtex, was invented for them by Czechoslovakia when they were under Soviet rule. You don't get your very own type of explosive designed for you and made for you and shipped to you by a Soviet satellite country if the Soviets don't want it to happen.
Exactly. Yeah, the title of the piece that I wrote is dated August 21st, Reassessing Splits in the Communist World. So it's a general essay paper. And even though Iraq and the Islamists were not communist, I still included them. I probably should just abbreviate or change the title a little bit. But I do talk about that and how Islamists and communists can collaborate. For example, I talk about how even Al-Qaeda and various communist countries and intelligence agencies collaborate. It doesn't mean Al-Qaeda is communist, but disparate groups can come together against a common enemy. It's just like the Nazis, for example. You brought up the Nazis a little while ago. Well, it was the KPD in the Soviet Union informally backed the Nazi Party in its struggle for power. And I do have an expanded version of a book that I wrote about Nazi-communist collaboration, and it's going to be on my Substack because I found so much more information on that. Doesn't mean they're the same, or I mean they're both, yes, collectivist and totalitarian in their orientation, but obviously they have very different goals in many ways. But they can still collaborate with each other because they still have a common enemy, which is of the old Weimar Republic, and then, of course, the West. And then they can turn on each other, too, as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that also reminds me of one last point before we change topics, which is that you were asking about, whether the Nazis or others, were trying to fool Westerners into thinking they were Westerners too. What was my point? It was there, and then I lost it, and it'll come back.
Well, the Nazis were trying to fool the West, and they would undertake various measures to do that.
Yeah, there was something you were saying right before that was triggering a memory in me. And now I've lost.
Well, I was talking about how the Nazis and the German Communist Party aligned against the Weimar Republic.
Yes. Now I remember. Priorities. So both the Nazis and the Soviets did this, and also the communists in the Spanish Civil War also. They disagreed with either each other or with other people in their coalitions as to whether or not they would prioritize, winning the war that they thought they needed to fight first, or having the domestic social revolution they wanted first. So in the Spanish Civil War, the anarcho-syndicalists believed that they had to have the social revolution first, and that would enable them to win the war. Whereas the communists in the Spanish Civil War took the opposite position, that they wanted to win the war first and have the social revolution afterwards. And ironically, the Nazis, I think, were the same way. They wanted to win the war first and then have their social revolution afterwards. And I think this is a big part of what fooled people into thinking that these groups were a lot more moderate than they really were. It was not so much a matter of what their ultimate goals were, it was their immediate priorities, were not so clearly related to what those ultimate goals really were.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In fact, Hitler had admitted that, according to a defecting Nazi official. Yeah, and he wrote a book called "I Knew Hitler," and it was published in 1938. And he was a defecting Nazi, Kurt Ludek, and Hitler had told Ludek that he would hold, quote, aloft the bogey of Bolshevism by convincing the West that Germany would be, quote, the last bulwark against the Red Flood. According to Hitler, according to Ludek's recollection, the goal was, quote, to get rid of Versailles. This is what Hitler was saying. The goal was to, quote, get rid of Versailles and rearm. Socialism must come in the second line. According to Ludek, Hitler's deception program during the U.S. involved, this is my writings from my notes, disinformation which portrayed Germany, according to, this is Ludek's quote of Hitler's strategy, as a safeguard for American investments, and that the idea be disseminated that capitalism and Jewry need not look too fearfully towards a national socialist regime. So, I mean, this is, again, what we're talking about. I mean, and then, of course, Ludek talks about how Hitler, according to Hitler, he wanted the, quote, gold hyenas to, quote, swim in their own blood in every capital of Europe and America. And Hitler believed that he should wait to rearm and then bomb the, quote, gold hyenas in London, Paris, and New York. I mean, this is, come on. I mean, it's like, give me a break. They're lying to you. I mean, yeah. I guess when you have if you lay bare your ideology to the world, I mean, nobody's really going to like it other than certain extremists and elements within the elites, perhaps. But most people are going to, rearm very quickly and be like, you're not doing this, and we're going to beef up our military to prevent you from bombing our gold hyenas, so to speak. Which is, of course, ironic. A good chunk of those gold hyenas were the very people that ignored willfully the evidence that the Nazis were revolutionary and were implementing their own heterodox form of socialism that was not particularly business friendly, if you think about it. So, yeah, that's what you're right on. You're spot on regarding that. And this is where I think people need to be disabused of the moderates versus the radicals. This happened in the Soviet Union, and Yuri Andropov, who was the hardest of the hardliners, was viewed as a liberalizer when he became the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The fact that he listened to jazz music and scotch and drank scotch is not a good thing, because that's stuff those are goods that are not available to the average Soviet citizen back then. So that's not such a great thing. When I read about that, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not a great thing. And of course, Gorbachev was viewed as this liberal communist, if you will. So
yeah. That's another thing that bugged me about Radchenko's book, is he was trying to play Gorbachev off as being, completely committed to peace, and he didn't even say anything about the violent crackdowns that Gorbachev ordered in the Baltics towards the end. I just thought that was a glaring omission.
And in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, I mean, to the point reportedly that poison gas was used, and this was in, I think, 1988 or 1989. I mean, and the Gulag still remained open. It was never completely closed down under Gorbachev or Yeltsin, and certainly not under Putin.
Yeah.
So now getting on to, and we could do this another time if you want, otherwise, because this could be a whole long topic on the election.
I think we should talk about it a bit.
Yeah, we could talk about it, and we can do it to be continued if we want. So we have in the Democratic candidate, we have Kamala Harris. We have as the presidential frontrunner, Vice President, former U.S. Senator from Canada, California. It's getting
Close.
late.
Right.
And and then we have Tim Walz, who's the former congressman from Minnesota, also governor of Minnesota. And then we have on the Republican side, Donald Trump and Senator J.D. Vance as the VP nominee. So, look, I'm politically homeless. My ideas in economics and politics and national security is very eclectic. For those of you first tuning in, I guess my heroes would be people like as disparate as former President Teddy Roosevelt, former Senator Jesse Helms, former Senator Scoop Jackson or Henry Jackson. I liked aspects of Franklin Roosevelt. Foreign policy views on the Soviet Union was a disaster, as was one of his sins. Although he was kind of contradictory on his views on the Soviets, actually, when you dig through the evidence, which is weird. So that's where I like George Meany, Lane Kirkland, both the AFL-CIO. These are heroes of mine, where I get a lot of my economic and political and national security. And there's a bunch of other people. There's former Congressman Walter Jones, the late Walter Jones of North Carolina, who's a Republican. I liked him a lot on a lot of issues, on many issues. And he made alliances with libertarians as well as also liberal Democrats. He was a populist. I would not term him anti-capitalist. He was not popular with the Republican establishment either. So that's where I come from. For those of you who are tuning in for the first time, that's why I call it the Politically Homeless Podcast. You're not going to get straight conservative incorporated point of view on this program. And you're certainly not going to get a position that advances socialism, communism, or fascism as properly defined. Because otherwise, then I just might as well fire you as my guest and say, beat it, and and then that's the end of it, and get a whole new guest roster. Yep. So what are your thoughts on, let's start with Trump and Vance, strengths and weaknesses on national security. I mean, domestic we can talk about some other time, but let's do national security.
Okay, sure. Well, so I've been thinking about this sort of in my mind. There's, I think, still a bit of an open question and a debate about exactly where Trump and Vance are going to come down on the issue of Ukraine. And I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that. I have a theory that I'm hopeful about, but what I've been thinking about it lately is if we assume the worst, that they will, abandon Ukraine, which I don't think they will, but let's assume that for the sake of argument. In my mind, really, Ukraine is not just fighting Russia alone. They're up against a coalition of Russia plus Iran plus China. Russia's been getting supplies and weapons from Iran and China, and there's even the possible discussion of some military troop reinforcements from China recently going to Russia. That would be really bad news if that happens. I hope it won't. Probably not, but I could be wrong. But I think that overall, Trump and Vance are going to be a hell of a lot better on Iran and China than Harris and Walz have any chance of being. Trump was already pretty hard on China before. I don't think he really knew what he was up against there, because I think he didn't take anywhere near a hard enough line with China. But I think he's learned a lot since then, and I think he's likely to, be a lot harder line with China if he gets another chance. And I don't see Vance jeopardizing that in any way. There are a lot of things I like about Vance. I like the way he presents himself. I think he's funny. He's good with off-the-cuff remarks. He thinks well on his feet. He's certainly not afraid of doing interviews. Obviously neither is Trump. But Trump, I think, does have a little bit more of a habit of putting his foot in his mouth at times with stuff he says off the cuff. I don't really enjoy listening to him speak most of the time. I did watch his acceptance speech at the debate, and I thought that was very good, mostly because, the first half of it was all about what it was like, being shot at and taking a bullet that thankfully was not at all fatal, but at least not to him. Other people weren't so lucky. So I did find that, whole episode very moving, not just his acceptance speech where he told the story, but, the day it happened. I didn't see it happen live, but I heard about it shortly afterwards and, watched everything I could about it as soon as I could. I think Trump's going to be a hell of a lot better on Iran and China. I think he basically had the right approach to Iran already in his first term. And I know he's going to be very supportive of Israel. Although I heard somebody describing him as an Israel firster, I don't think that's true at all. I think he's, very much putting America's priorities first, but he sees that Israel is, an ally that we simply can't afford to do without and not support over there. I've thought for a long time that in a lot of ways, I think there's a very strong analogy to be made between Israel and Ukraine as U.S. allies. I just think Ukraine is a lot earlier on in the stage of development as a U.S. ally. But, I was very impressed with an article I read a while back about the U.S.-Israeli alliance, which pointed out that even though we were one of the first to recognize Israel, we didn't actually help Israel very much until the 1970s, until the Nixon administration. In the Six-Day War, Israel was flying French fighter jets, not American fighters, because France was one of their biggest allies back then, not us. But what happened was that in 1970, when the PLO tried to overthrow the King of Jordan, there was a threat by Syria that Syria would intervene in support of the PLO in Jordan. But Israel deterred them. And the Nixon administration saw that and concluded rightly that Israel was a stabilizing force in the Middle East. And that, if Israel could deter these countries like Syria or Egypt, then the United States wouldn't have to. And so Nixon really stepped up U.S. aid for Israel starting then. And I think it's pretty clear that in 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, that Israel would have lost that war and probably been wiped out if it hadn't been for U.S. logistical support. So I think we've had, a pretty secure relationship with Israel like that ever since. That's the kind of relationship I think we need to have with Ukraine. Like us to see us, go in that direction. I just don't know whether or not we can say for sure at this point in time whether or not, that's what Trump is going to try to do. And I think he's clearly the one calling the shots. I think J.D. Vance is going to, go along with whatever Trump decides, which is fine. I don't expect that much from a vice president to, get into a major foreign policy conflict with his president right away. But, I think that probably sums up my feelings about them on national security at this time.
Yeah, I think this is a typical situation where you have Kamala Harris, Tim Walz versus Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, where, they both have their good points and they both have points of concern. And I guess we can unpack this, bit by bit. I think with the Trump-Pence administration that we had was very contradictory. They did a number of good things on the national security front. I think one of the biggest positives that Trump brought into the national conversation was the fact that China was a threat and that they were committing all forms of aggression against the United States economically, politically, and even throughout the world, too, even militarily and through subversion. And I think Trump has forced that into the national conversation. And even in some respects, President Biden's administration has kept some of that to a degree. Now, there are some things where Biden has done where some areas he's loosened sanctions, but in other ways he has tightened sanctions, particularly on green technologies as well as semiconductors. But there are other areas where he has loosened sanctions too as well. So, but the same also applied with Trump too as well. And part of that was because Trump's administration had two factions. He had people who were very good, like Peter Navarro, who's an economist, as well as Robert Lighthizer too, who was a lawyer, and they dealt with related trade and manufacturing issues in the Trump administration. And of course, their responsibilities also crossed into national security matters. And they were much more, they took my positions basically on trade, which is more a reasonable form of protectionisms and tariffs, and they were for industrial policy. And they were very much worried about the growth and the economic and military power of the Chinese Communist Party. But on the other side, there were corporate Democrats. There were sort of libertarian free market type people like Larry Kudlow, Gary Cohn, people like Steve Schwartzman, people who are Wall Street people, Steve Mnuchin, Art Laffer, Stephen Moore. These were all people that had long histories of either doing business with China and the Communist Party dictatorship there, or supporting trade with China to the point where Laffer in particular and Moore wrote in a book that's kind of revealing, and it's one of the many reasons why I've really soured on most of the right as well as free market libertarian types. Of course, they're not all the same, but it was really just something else. Art Laffer wrote in a book. It was Art Laffer and Stephen Moore, Return to Prosperity, published in 2010. And he wrote that a country is headed by a bad person does not mean that the United States should not trade with that country. Without China, there is no Walmart. And without Walmart, Americans would all be a lot poorer. I'm not going to begin to unpack that statement because I would spend a half hour doing that in a rage. But that gives you an idea of kind of the mentality that you're dealing with. And they were very active in the Trump administration. And some of those individuals like Laffer and Moore have been active in Project 2025, which concerns me a lot on a whole host of issues. Mm-hmm. And that concerns me because they have a lot of power and they have a lot of clout, particularly with congressional Republicans. Yeah. And those forces, according to Peter Navarro, if you want to choose a source, not in his most recent book, but his last book, sabotage the Trump administration's signature policy issues, including on the issue of China. That concerns me about Trump. Yeah. Big time. And then, Trump did a lot of good. He pledged to beef up the military. I think that's excellent. I think he has also put sanctions on the Russians, although I will say that Putin criticized as well as supported Trump in late 2020 when he appreciated Trump's continued economic engagement with the Russians. So even though we put certain sanctions with them, he still praised aspects of Trump and Biden in a speech in late 2020. So I think Trump withdrawing from the INF treaty was excellent and long overdue, because
Yes.
every Russian leader since Gorbachev was violating that agreement as soon as it was signed.
Yeah.
I think Trump withdrawing American economic aid and financial aid to the Palestine Authority, dominated by Mahmoud Abbas, who's Arafat's successor, and Al Fatah, PLO, was a good deal, was good. I think that was positive. I don't think we should be aiding them. And it's not even because whether I have special love for Israel or not, that has nothing to do with it. They're not a friend of the United States. Even if Israel didn't exist and they wiped Israel off the map, they still would be coming after the United States ultimately.
Yes, precisely.
My opinion. I think Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA, the so-called Iran deal that Obama negotiated, I think that was a very good move on his part.
Yes.
So there's a whole bunch of issues here. I think Trump's granted very ham-fisted way of dealing with China. I think tariffs are only part of a whole policy toolbox that we can use to bring industry back to the United States. And that's a very long conversation, how to do that.
Yeah.
But at least he kind of he brought the issue of the China threat to more of a bipartisan consensus. And I appreciate that. Now, negatively, I mentioned some of the things, obviously, with China and Russia. I mean, under Trump, the trade deficit still climbed and increased with China and Russia. That's not a good thing. When you take a look at his policy towards Turkey and Sudan was not good either. Turkey under the what is it?
Erdogan?
Peace and Justice. Yeah, Erdogan. What's the name of his party? The Peace and Justice Party. I forget the name of it.
And it's what, AKP in Turkish?
Yeah, AKP, exactly. And they were aligned with the Russians and China to some degree, and they definitely were anti-American because they're Islamists. I think we need to explore the possibility of expelling Turkey from NATO along with Viktor Orban's Hungary.
Yeah.
I think we need to explore that. I know that's a delicate issue, obviously, but we sold them under Trump F-35 fighters. I don't think that's a good idea in the long term necessarily. Number two, Trump also lifted the sanctions on Islamist Sudan, even though Sudan continued to support terrorism. In my upcoming piece on Trump, I will be discussing that. That's also in volume 2 of my book, Turning the Page, My Evolution from Conservatism to Radical Civic Nationalism. But I'm going to expand upon that again because we are in an election and Trump is running. So I want to put new information in that and put it on my Substack in abbreviated form. So I have concerns about that. In Sudan, under Trump, reaffirmed their alliance with the Russian Federation too, as well as a tool to use against the United States. So
didn't they just also have a Russian-sponsored coup in Sudan?
That I'm not sure of. The only coup that I'm familiar with in Sudan, well, I mean, there were several coups in Sudan's history. There was one in 1989. I think it was in the spring or summer of 1989, which brought the former military dictator, who was an Islamist general, Umar Bashir. But I don't know if there was anything recently.
I think I was reading something about the group called the Rapid Support Forces. It's either in Sudan or another African country about the same latitude. And the RSF was sponsored by Russia.
Well, there was one in Niger and I think Mali, which brought in pro-Russian, anti-imperialist leaders in power.
Yeah.
So, Trump, it's a mixed bag. I like J.D. Vance's positions on industrial policy and his position on China. His position on Russia deeply concerns me. We have to see if he's going to represent the Tucker Carlson wing of the Republican Party and push a Russia a pro-Russia policy on Trump, because Trump has a tendency to believe the last person in the room, as well as also to believe people that flatter and manipulate him. And he has a weakness for that. And I think the forces of evil might use that. My other concern is his alliance with RFK Jr., as well as also Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. Now, I applaud Congresswoman Gabbard's service. I mean, she's also a fitness fanatic like I am and likes water sports. But on foreign policy issues, I mean, I agree to a point. And if you read my piece on Substacks on my a sensible defense policy, I have a healthy skepticism towards the corruption and the strong arm tactics of the military industrial complex, as well as I have a skepticism of deploying American troops and intervening throughout the world. But my issue with Gabbard, where I depart from her, is her very benign and really, she really serves as an apologist for China, Russia, and Syria. And that disturbs me to no end. You can have a healthy skepticism of the military industrial complex and foreign wars and still not have any illusions on who our geopolitical adversaries are. That's my concern with her. RFK, there are some aspects of his platform I liked, but again, his explanations on various national security issues related to Russia and China, for example, Ukraine notably, is like pulled out of the script of an Oliver Stone movie, essentially. He is Oliver Stone, essentially, just not in the movie business. Now, Harris and Tim Walz. Now, Senator Harris, and this is where it gets a little tricky, because I disagree with people like James A. Lindsay, for example, who I really have grown to kind of dislike his approach on Twitter with people. I think he's giving anti-communists a bad name. And I take the James Burnham approach, and he once, in his book, The Coming Defeat of Communism, he reproached the real hardcore conservatives, including in the business community, that can't distinguish between an anarchist, a eccentric dissident, and a communist and a social democrat. Not everybody who is a leftist or proposes economic interventionist is a communist automatically. With that stated, when I look at Kamala Harris, I think Kamala does what's good for Kamala. In California, you have to balance a variety of political forces, and she is doing that. She got her starts in the Bay Area, in San Francisco politics. Willie Brown was a CPUSA adjacent politician from San Francisco. And she got her start in that community. Does it mean, in my opinion, that she believes in that? No, I think she used that as a stepping stone for a political office. Because when she was picked for vice president, the Wall Street investors, investment community, and the multinational corporations absolutely loved her. They were relieved that Biden picked her over somebody who would be more of a left populist or who was more pro-labor. When you take a look at even who's populating her campaign, many are from big tech, from Uber and other very, very wealthy corporations. Let's just leave it at that. On the other hand, she has people that are very concerning, like her national security advisor signed on to a piece. I'm trying to find it here, where it was a letter, and it was written, I think, in the Washington Post, and it was where, and this is Harris, it's Phil, I forget his last name, oh my gosh. Oh gosh. Well, he wrote basically that China is not an enemy, essentially.
Right. No,
And
I can't think.
Phil, I forget his name, and I'm trying to find it in my notes, and I can't. I know I have it somewhere, and that's concerning. And he's advising her on foreign policy, and yet he signed this open letter, and it dated from 2019. You also have an article in the National Pulse where headline Kamala Harris's husband, who is a lawyer, law firm, a proprietor of a law firm, represents Chinese Communist Party-owned corporates and employs ex-CCP officials. And this is the firm DLA Piper, who consults on behalf of a whole bunch of Chinese Communist Party-owned companies. That's concerning too. When you look at Kamala Harris saying that I am not one of those, quote, protectionist Democrats, and she goes against the tariffs on dumped Chinese communist goods, that concerns me as well, to the point where she, in my opinion, dishonestly portrays it, doesn't use the word tariffs, and I think she does that deliberately. She calls it a tax to give it a more negative tinge to it, the 10% across the board tariff that Trump has proposed, especially on all goods, including Chinese goods. Yeah. That concerns me about her. She obviously on the surface is very pro-Ukraine, is has very negative views on the Russian Federation and his threat. In fact, Russian TV, Andrei Sidorov, the Dean of World Politics at Moscow State University, YouTube, please don't strike me for this. I'm not a racist, okay? I have to read this for the audience's sake. Kamala with a nuclear button is worse than a monkey with a grenade. So you have, obviously the Russians are obviously not thrilled to her, to say the least. In fact, they like Biden even better. One Oleg Matveyev said, "If Harris stays, what do we know about her? She is a distilled evil. At least Biden represented a remnant of the old conservative American. You have the devil in his purest form." So that I thought is very interesting. But she also has, getting back to her background, she was recommended on the VP shortlist by Steve Phillips, and Trevor has pointed this out, Trevor Loudon, for those of you who don't know who I'm referring to. And he was active at Stanford University in the League for Revolutionary Struggle, which was a Maoist splinter communist group. And in a 2012 blog post, he said, "I come out of the left. I've studied Marx, Mao, and Lenin." And in California, you have a variety of political forces you need to play ball with. You have to play ball with the hard left. And the hard left in California still exists. In fact, they rescinded a law in recent years that allows, in their state assembly, communists to serve. So this gives you an idea of what you're dealing with in California. So you have to kind of play footsie with the hard left. You also have to play footsie with the Chinese American community, because other than New York City, California has a huge, particularly in the Bay Area, San Francisco, a large Chinese American community, and that has been overseas Chinese community has been heavily penetrated by the CCP, even before the CCP took power in October of 1949. She knows that. She's not stupid.
Yep.
You have to placate that group. And then you have to placate large multinational corporations, particularly like Google and Uber and Lyft, and large Wall Street investment firms.
Yep.
And she has to play ball with those people. She also has to play ball with other groups like labor unions and other organizations and the causes of the woke left, if you want to use the term colloquially, as well. And, a variety of other issues, interest groups that you and I more support, like the military industrial complex. So she has to balance all these forces. And that's my estimation on Kamala Harris. I also don't like the fact that she also, along with Tim Walz, wants to restore the Iran deal. I think that would be a huge mistake. So Kamala Harris, like Trump, is a mixed bag. It's just going by what I'm reading. I think Trump would be better on national security than Harris when you weigh everything together. But I'm an independent. I am not a loyal Republican, even though technically I'm a registered Republican. But, you know, I'm not going to say the Democrats are Satan's spawn. I'm going to look at the votes, the policies, the statements, the background, and try and piece together a reasonable analysis. What I feel is a reasonable analysis. Do I trust Kamala Harris? No, she's a consummate politician. I don't think she particularly has strong beliefs either way. I think Kamala does what's good for Kamala. I think in many ways Trump is also malleable and does what's good for Trump. I think, unfortunately, in this election, the cream has not risen to the top in regards to leaders in our choice of candidates, and that sucks. You know, I think we need to do better in regards to having a political elite in this country. And I'm not going to hold my breath and waiting for that to happen. With Tim Walz, now Tim Walz, on a personal level, based on what I see in his speeches and the convention, he's the kind of guy I would like to have beer with on a personal level. Politics on national security, he's an interesting case. Like Kamala Harris, it's the case of sleeping with one eye closed and one eye open. That insinuates not 100% trust. There's a very interesting piece in theconversation.com titled, Republicans Believe Tim Walz Has Been Groomed by China, but How Does China View Him? So, yes, he has joined with Republicans in Congress, as numerous articles, including this one's mention about his meetings with the Dalai Lama, the Hong Kong democracy activist Joshua Wong, and his various bills that put sanctions on China, particularly on regards to officials and entities that enslave non-compliant Uyghurs in Xinjiang. However, there are a lot of areas which concern me about Mr. Walz. For example, in 2016, when he said publicly that, well, China doesn't necessarily have to be an adversary of the United States. Well, hello, it's not a matter of not China having to be an adversary. They are an adversary, sir. Mr. Governor, they are an adversary. Yeah. He also says that he is, I think, a friend of China. I'm trying to find this here. Walls of friendship with China. Okay, let me look that up. I'm just going to read the exact quote because this is very important. Oh yeah, and then this was a video that was unearthed by Republicans, and obviously they're doing it for self-serving purposes. But the video has Walz saying that, quote, he's pretty friendly with China. So when you look at those quotes that are very, very concerning, even though he has some of these good votes in Congress, and we could argue that it might be symbolic, these are concerning positions. His operation of this student exchange company that does these two-way exchanges with China, on the surface, yeah, people-to-people diplomacy, that sounds wonderful in theory, but the question is what kind of profits he's made, who has he made the money from, was it CCP interests? Was this travel/student exchange company used and abused by the United Front Work Party, United Front Work Department, and the International Liaison Department of the CCP? So that would be my questions to him. I applaud him for positions on certain votes that are directed against the CCP, but here he has these positions in this company where he is dealing with the Chinese and potentially opening up severe potential national security concerns. When he was teaching in China, he had taught during a lesson on China's communist system in November 1991, according to the Washington Free Beacon. Quote, "It means that everyone is the same and everyone shares. The doctor and the construction worker make the same. The Chinese government and the place they work for provide housing, and 14 kilograms or about 30 pounds of rice per month. They get food and housing." Well, I beg to differ that in a communist society, nobody is the same and not everybody shares. And that's a very simplistic and not honest way of portraying it, because back in 1991, as is today, the society was very unequal between the CCP nomenclatura, known as the Red Princes and Red Princesses, actually. So yeah, that really concerns me there. So again, like Trump, like Vance, like Harris, sleep with one eye closed, but definitely one eye wide open. Areas of other concerns about Walz. Walz agrees with Harris against Trump's so-called trade war, which was started by China to begin with. Walz has taken positions for restoring the Iran deal, as well as, hold on to your seat, Tim, please don't fall out of that nice brown leather chair that I kind of like there. But he actually calls for allowing communist Cuba to purchase American agricultural products on credit, even though Cuba is a horrible credit risk. If we remember, Cuba in the 1970s and the early 1980s took a whole slew of loans and credits from Western governments and banks, as well as banks in Japan, as well as their ally Gaddafi's Libya, and they never paid it back. They just barely made interest essentially. Cuba's a horrible credit risk. I don't think we should be selling them food even for cash. I mean, to be perfectly honest, because there's deep problems with that. So, I do appreciate Tim Walz. He takes a very strong stand regarding Ukraine and against Russia. I think that's excellent, and he has spoken at Ukraine aid rallies. So, what is my opinion? All four of these people are like ricocheting bullets. You shoot the gun and the bullet ricochets everywhere. And I think, to be honest with you, I think we have to be careful with all these candidates. I think everyone out there, you have to vote your conscience and vote in whoever you feel is stronger with national security. Because I have people across the divide here politically, and I don't particularly like any of the candidates. I have severe concerns. There are things I agree with all of them. Of course, I could list certain domestic economic policies and certain domestic economic and immigration and crime policies I don't agree with them, all four of them on. That's why I'm an independent at heart. But I'm not happy with these candidates. If you want the strongest on national defense, I say this gritting my teeth and holding my nose. The Republicans tend to be stronger. But and this is where I agree with Jean Rabin, who was on that last anti-communist roundtable on his YouTube channel. I agree with him temperamentally. But I think I agree also with Trevor and Jeff that there's a part of me that also you have to vote for the one who is marginally better on national defense policies. And you just have to compare the records if you're voting on national defense issues. And you have my answer, and you stated my point earlier when you said that Trump and Vance would be much better on national defense issues. But I'm also laying out the facts because on this show, I'm going to call balls and strikes.
Yep.
And, one thing I also do appreciate about Harris is that she also definitely I think legislation, but definitely speech-wise, she has definitely called Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela basically a corrupt totalitarian state. Although Biden has opened up for the promise of elections, has lifted the sanctions on imported Venezuelan oil. We all know how those elections went down in Venezuela, yet another rigged communist-style election where the opposition leaders basically have to go from safe house to safe house, fleeing for their lives, basically. So again, I think what it comes down to, and I know I've said a lot, and I'm going to sit back and let you comment for 20 minutes because I got to extend that courtesy to you. But I think this is why we do these programs. And I think if you're active out there in your local Republican or Democratic club, you have to pressure your leaders and educate your leaders as best as you can on these issues so we can eventually elect candidates from the bottom up who are consistently, I don't want to say against Russia and China, but are realistic in their understanding of what Russia and China and their allies represent. That we have to have a consistent across the board strategy in treating Russia, China, Iran, Sudan, Turkey, Hungary, Belarus, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba, and a whole host of other countries and governments I haven't listed, that they all are one, essentially, that they are against the long-term geopolitical interests and even existence of the United States. And we have to drum that into these people's heads because you're not going to get it from your presidents and vice presidents. And unfortunately, a good number of congressmen and senators. So where you might have Marjorie Taylor Greene saying some hostile things or realistic things against the CCP, she just is in a love fest with Putin's Russia. And that's my biggest concern is when I look at the Democrats and the Republicans, it's like, as you said, it's like good cop, get bad cop. It's like, oh, we don't like the CCP, but Russia, they're not so bad. Or, oh, we can make some exceptions and maybe lift the sanctions on Cuba and let them rack up more debt to Western creditors like Tim Walz seems to support. So I know there's a lot to digest, but I'm going to give you 20 or 30 minutes to talk.
Okay, I'll see what I can come up with here. I guess I would start with Walz just because I don't know as much about Minnesota, but to me, the first thing that struck me when he was chosen was that, as far as I know, Minnesota is one of the most left-wing states in the country. So my traditional understanding of how you're supposed to pick your vice presidential running mate is that you're supposed to pick somebody who's going to help you win states that you otherwise would not be likely to win. And Harris is already one of the most left-wing politicians in the country from one of the most left-wing states in the country. So I don't see how having him on the ticket really helps her with that. I don't get that. The other big concern I really share with you, I think, about Walz, but if anything, I think I may have a stronger version of it, is that, I remember how when I was a baby, my parents decided to take a belated honeymoon. They were, got married before I was born, but didn't take a honeymoon until I was 18 months old. So we flew to Europe, and they bought a VW van camper, and we drove across Europe. And I don't really remember very much of this trip because I was too young, but one of the things I remember being told about was that the only socialist country that we could go to was Yugoslavia, because my father had been a translator in the army. They sent him to Monterey. He learned Russian. Sent him to Hokkaido in Japan, where he translated Russian radio messages. This was in the 60s. And so because of that, he had a security clearance of some level. I don't know what. The people I've asked about it, who were in Army intelligence, think it was probably just a basic, secret level classification. But because of that, he wasn't allowed to go to any Soviet bloc countries. And probably also, I think what I was told at least was that they wouldn't let him in either. But we were able to go to Yugoslavia. So with that in mind, I heard about Walz going. He was a command sergeant major, and he was allowed to go to China once a year for 30 years, and China let him in. I just asked myself,
it's a good point.
What other country in the world that is, I would say, morally equivalent to China today would somebody be able to do that and still be taken seriously as a vice presidential candidate? If he had gone to Venezuela once a year for 30 years, would we be saying, oh, that's fine? Venezuela is not necessarily a bad country to visit. If he had been going to Cuba, would we feel this way? If he was running for office 30 years after the end of World War II and he had been going to the Soviet Union for 30 years, would we have felt like, oh, there's no problem with that, that's fine? Or if he was running in 1940 and he had been going to Germany for the past 30 years once a year, would we think, oh, there's nothing wrong with that? Germany is a perfectly fine country. It's not necessarily our enemy. That sort of thing really rubs me the wrong way and makes me suspicious to the point of, the hair standing up on the back of my neck. I think about also my paternal grandfather, whom I didn't really know very well, unfortunately. He didn't get along with my father at all. And I think there's good reasons on both sides of that relationship. But he was actually the highest ranking enlisted man in the U.S. Army. He was a command sergeant major in charge of NATO forces in Europe. And today, the equivalent rank to that is the sergeant major of the Army, I believe, if I have that right. And I just think about, what if he had gone to a foreign country like that was ruled by a communist regime? Would this not be considered a security risk? I have a hard time swallowing that, no matter how you try to sugarcoat the pill.
Well, I was, well, it's even worse than even what you say. And, what I was reading from the Washington Free Beacon article, and those of you who want to access that, you can, it's free. And it has actual reproductions of the newspaper clippings on it. And where I read to the audience about his views and what he was teaching about communist China. I mean, I understand you're going to get kicked out if you teach anti-CCP things, but what are you doing there to begin with? I mean, why are you doing that? Why not teach in some other country? I mean, it's just, personally with me, dude, I would not want to put myself in a position where I would go to a totalitarian nation and be basically an accessory to the state propaganda apparatus. And that's and as I read that article, and again, for those of you, I really, and it's going to be in my upcoming paper on the Biden-Harris walls. And I know, I'm sorry. It's just, this is important stuff. And this is what the Chinese are saying. I hope you're not mad at me. The students liked him. That's great and wonderful. The Beijing News underscored his political accomplishments, including champion progressive policies in Minnesota. The paper, a state-owned online publication, focused on Walz's appeal to independent voters and moderate Republicans, so they like some of his policies. Granted, they're more social democratic than communist or regulated capitalist. The China Daily, which is more of a major paper, they have an online version. They mention his support for non-adversarial relations with China, praising his capacity to make more, quote, more rational and informed decisions on U.S.-China relations. Well, my friend, that's a very significant statement. What do they know? What are they being told by the Central Party apparatus? That obviously he would serve as an agent of influence. And I hate to speak loosely, but that's what I'm getting the sense from. In the same article, it noted that Vance called China, quote, China the biggest threat to the U.S. The paper contended that Walz's criticism of China could reflect Democratic Party, quote, prejudices rather than his personal views. So maybe he's just kind of getting on the train, hiding maybe what his true views are.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I was going to say here was what really concerns me.
This is not good. This is not good.
Yeah. What the other thing that really concerns me about him is that he wasn't just going there by himself. He was bringing kids with him.
Yes.
I guarantee you China will be assigning people to befriend those kids and try and establish long-term relationships with them and try and cultivate them as assets in whatever way they possibly can for life.
Mm-hmm.
This is how they operate. This is what they do. You know, we know one specific example of how they operate with the Chinese woman that they sent over to sleep with Eric Swalwell, another congressman from California. And, you know, her mission apparently was to seduce as many local American politicians as she possibly could. She was going to the National Conference of Mayors or something. You know, this is what they do. It's standard recruitment stuff: compromise, money, ideology, and ego. Right?
Yep.
Those are the standard motivations for somebody to be a foreign asset of some sort, and maybe not a spy, but agent of influence. Also, I guarantee you they've been trying to do that, and he's been bringing these kids over for 30 years, and hopefully nothing ever came of it. I don't know if it ever has, but again, to be as apparently oblivious to that security risk as he seems to have been is just mind-boggling to me. You know, now on the other hand, you know, by way of counterexample, I know of people that have gone over to either China or similar countries in the area to try and teach and, you know, be professors of economics and stuff, you know, or political science. And the two examples I can think of, Christopher Lingle and the other guy whose name is escaping me right now, they both ended up getting kicked out for being too controversial. Mm-hmm. That's because they were willing to say what they actually thought and, you know, push the boundaries of free speech over there. And good for them. But, you know, it goes to show that there really is a limit to what you're allowed to say and do over there. You know, I know there was one, you know, teeny tiny little free market think tank in China, and this one guy who is running it has basically been persecuted out of his office and stuff. And I think the only way he's able to make a living there anymore is he basically gets hired as a consultant by businessmen who want to have a clue as to how free markets actually operate, so they can actually run a business and sell stuff to the rest of the world, because they have no clue otherwise. And, you know, even I haven't been to China. I've only talked to people who've been there, but even there's some ways that it operates that's very different and strange to Westerners. So I knew a guy who went over there to work as a video game programmer for a while, maybe a few years. So there are a couple of things he told me that I think just give a good sort of concrete sense of how alien it really is over there. And these are kind of mundane. They're not, you know, the most tyrannical things in the world. But one of them is that I guess at least if you're living in an apartment over there, you pay for your electricity a month in advance. Otherwise, you don't have electricity.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing he told us is that every year in the fall, there's a month where I think it's October where everybody gets sick. And the reason everybody gets sick is because they don't turn the heat on that month. They wait until it gets cold enough the month after that, and then they turn on the heat, and then people stop getting sick. So to me, that just shows the kind of society we're talking about where, there is this very high degree of central control and authoritarianism that is, very obvious to everyone who's over there. And, Walz is running around basically, playing nice with them and saying, let's be friends and all sing Kumbaya by the campfire. There's a place for that, but I think it's got to be balanced out by some actual criticism. And that is just not allowed if you want to go over there and if you ever want to go back.
Yeah, and to me, he is basically subordinating or removing his moral compass by doing that. Now, before I continue, because there's really some interesting stuff that the Chinese entities are saying about him, a little plug about Christopher Lingle. He has written an excellent book called Singapore's Authoritarian Capitalism in 1996, because Singapore is held as a free market miracle, and Lingle, I think, is the only scholar. And he also wrote, I think it was an article about Singapore's controlled capitalism in Reason magazine that I read back when I was in undergraduate school. I remember it. And Lingle is he's done some very good work on Singapore and whatnot. So if you want to read a good book about the Singapore economy under Lee Kuan Yew and the People's Action Party, as I think it was called, read that book. But anyway, so the China-U.S. Focus, a publication of the China-United States Exchange Foundation, which is a front of the Communist CCP's United Front Work Department. In that publication, China-U.S. Focus, associated with the CCP's United Front Work Department, okay, they say that Walz's unique China experience is an asset that will directly affect Harris's China policy. From the Chinese perspective, Walz is a person China is willing to proactively engage with. So, directly is an asset that will directly affect Harris's China policy.
Yep.
So, let's dissect that. What does that mean to you? Does that let the cat out of the bag?
You're asking me. What it makes me think of is the arrangement that Dianne Feinstein had with her husband, Richard Blum, where he was basically doing all of these business deals with China, and she supposedly didn't know anything about any of them because they never talked business. Either that's not true, or she's even more oblivious than I thought she was. And she ended up having a Chinese spy for a driver. I think there's, they will grease whatever palms they think they need to grease to pay people off, to get them on their side and do whatever they want you to do. And I think a lot of politicians will be perfectly happy to accept this in one way or another, if not themselves personally, then their spouses or their family members. And that's how they do business with everyone. And they'll do it with us as much as we let them get away with it.
Yeah, well, it shows they expect something from him. That's my interpretation. Yeah. That statement connotates expectation.
Yeah.
And what do they know that you and I don't know?
Yeah, to me, that's just a given. Anybody that's, been doing what he's doing with them, he's got to be delivering in some way. These people are not the most altruistic in the world. They're very nationally self-interested.
Yes.
You know, even the deals they've done with Russia since Russia invaded Ukraine, people are saying, oh, they signed all these deals to buy Russia's oil and gas from them. Well, they have a history of signing agreements and not paying.
Of
And
course, yeah.
even the deals they will sign, they will get the best possible terms, and squeeze the other person as much as they possibly can. And that's somebody that's supposed to be their great ally and on their side. We are definitely not in that camp from their perspective. The other thing I would probably have more to say about here is Harris, really, because I'm from California. I grew up there for more than 40 years. I was in the San Francisco Bay Area, born and raised in Berkeley. Went to San Francisco a lot, worked in San Francisco for multiple companies. I was actually, so Harris's predecessor as San Francisco DA was Terrence Hallinan, who was quite the leftist himself. But when he was first running for office, he campaigned, and one of the places he came to campaign was the local San Francisco Libertarian Party chapter monthly meeting. And he made his pitch. His pitch was that he was not going to prosecute victimless crimes, which is, something we all liked to hear, and we thought was pretty consistent with the libertarian philosophy. But the way I heard a story, I can't remember the details right now. Basically, he was going to go after, I believe it was a crony of Willie Brown's as a prosecutor, and they didn't want him to do that. So they basically had Harris take him out. I forget the exact details of how they did it. But I think that's a good example of how, in San Francisco, there is a Democratic Party machine that controls it's not just a city, it's a city and a county combined, the city and county of San Francisco. That's why it doesn't have a city council, it has a board of supervisors. And then, they basically took control of as much of the entire state as they possibly could. I call California a one-party state because, the only splits are basically between, far left Democrats and moderate Democrats. The Republicans are essentially an insignificant factor in the state. At the time that I was involved with the San Francisco Libertarian Party in San Francisco, we used to tease the Republicans by saying they had as much chance of winning as an election there as we did.
It's very true.
Yeah, basically none at all. And I have friends who ran for Congress against Pelosi, for instance, and they knew they had no chance, but they thought it was a way to try to get the word out. It's a one-party state. I remember when the Republicans used to have some traction in the state, it was basically because they were aligned with the law enforcement unions, the police officers and the prison guards. And in California, unions are almost entirely government employee unions. There's barely any industry, there left to speak of. But the last city I lived in there was Fremont, which used to have the last car factory on the West Coast. It was a joint venture between GM and Toyota that has since been closed down and was sold off to Tesla for pennies on the dollar. So that's now the Tesla factory in Fremont, California. That was a union shop, and as far as I know, a friend of mine's wife worked there as an accountant. As far as she could tell, it was always profitable, but they shut it down anyway because, it was for making gas cars and trucks, not electric vehicles. There's a one-party state. They've had a super majority there. I think Harris has been able to get away with being a very weak candidate in a lot of ways. She hasn't had to go up against much in the way of competition. She's been a political appointee and a crony, and she slept with Willie Brown to get started in the game, and apparently has absolutely zero shame about this whatsoever, even though he was married, but who cares because she's a Democrat. I don't think she's very smart. I think she's very superficial. She's been perfectly willing to run to the left of everybody else in whatever race she's running in, as far left as she can possibly go. Now that she's the nominee, she's trying to backtrack a little bit, but even then she comes up with whoppers like, oh, let's have price controls and we can stop price gauging, because she doesn't even know the difference between gauging and gouging, or she doesn't know how to pronounce gouging. And her father was an economist. You should understand price controls and price gouging, what they are at least, and how to pronounce them if your father was an economist. To me, this is astoundingly, vapid of her. So I just think she's awful on all grounds. And I don't say that about every Democrat, even though I am more of a Republican than a Democrat these days. The other thing I would want to bring up here is I think that their lip service about Russia and Ukraine is another case where they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk all that much. There's a lot of aid that's been allocated that is not being delivered by the Biden-Harris administration. And we don't know why. They won't say. They keep complaining, oh, it's because those evil, mean, nasty Republicans won't give them more money. But they have money that they've already been given that they're not spending. And I'm for giving Ukraine, more aid. Whatever they need to win as fast as possible to beat Russia so badly that they will never, ever try to do this again to anyone ever. But the Democrats have been, I saw a great line today. The Democrats have been providing Russia with their air defense. We've got this situation where Russian bombers are better protected by the restrictions we've imposed on Ukraine's ability to strike than Ukraine's civilians are. So why on earth should Ukrainian civilians be less protected than the Russian bombers and missiles that are attacking them?
Like the Vietnam War.
Yes, it's absolutely absurd. I've said this from the beginning, that Biden is replicating the whole problem of gradual escalated response that we had in the Vietnam War, where we just ratchet things up a little bit more. Maybe this time they'll take us seriously and Russia will actually, or Vietnam will actually stop. But no, they just say, oh, okay, we survived, so they don't really mean it. And, we can adapt and learn how to, not be destroyed by these, slightly worse attacks than we had inflicted on us before. And Russia knows this. They were very aware of how this went in the Vietnam War and other wars that they fought. So I don't buy their line of saying, oh, we're pro-Ukraine and the Republicans aren't. I don't think they really care all that much about Ukraine at all. I think they were dragged kicking and screaming into supporting Ukraine when Zelensky refused to flee the country, and he shamed them with his own courage, which I think was inspiring to everyone.
Yes.
I was amazed when Zelensky was addressing I believe it was the British House of Parliament, and the translator couldn't help but crying as he was translating Zelensky's speech. To me, this is amazing how courageous and inspiring he was. To me, he reminds me more of Winston Churchill than anyone else alive today, I think. And, I've been reading a biography of Churchill, the one by Andrew Roberts. My wife and I have been reading it together. And, we keep seeing all these similarities and parallels there. Obviously, they're not the same, but still a lot of similarities. And I just don't see Harris as comparable to any other good president we've ever had. I was reading something by this journalist.
No. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Yeah.
I was reading this article or headline by this journalist, Michael Weiss, who's written some good stuff about foreign policy. He wrote a book about the Islamic State, and I saw a talk by him on it. It was very good. But he was saying something about how, oh, Harris has found her inner Reagan. And that just makes me want to puke. I just finished reading a book about how Reagan beat the Soviet Union, and there's absolutely no similarity between Harris and Reagan. I'm sorry, it's just not there. None whatsoever. Not on economic policy, not on foreign policy, not on domestic policy, not in their level of charisma or their ability to speak, whether scripted or unscripted. And I'm not the world's biggest Reagan fan. When I was growing up, when he was in office, I didn't like him. I'm a bit of a born again Reagan appreciator, and I'm still fairly critical of him about a lot of things. But there's just no comparison. We were supposed to be electing somebody to be a successor to Washington or Lincoln or Jefferson or either of the Roosevelts or Eisenhower or FDR or Reagan or Kennedy. She just can't hold a candle to any of them.
No, no, no. I mean, she has burnished her image. She seems more likable than compared to 2020. 2020, she was one of my least favorite personality-wise candidates. But yeah, I couldn't.
Favorite. She didn't get a single vote in the primary.
It
and
was.
She didn't even run in the primary this time.
Yeah, in your talk about the slow walking aid to Ukraine, it kind of reminded me in my Sino-Soviet split essay when I was talking about how China and Russia were collaborating on Ukraine. And when I found this piece, and by the way, since my discussion with Alex Benish, I don't know if you watched those interviews, my opinion of Walz has really gone downhill. It's because that's after that interview with him, that's when I found that article with all the quotations from various Chinese party and state publications, and that really concerns me about him. But here's an interesting piece, getting back to that, to my point on the Sino-Soviet split essay. And this is from Axios, dated February 25th, 2022. Report: China told Russia about U.S. intel on invasion. Can't make this shit up. And here I read: intelligence passed by the U.S. to China on Russian invasion plans of Ukraine were then passed by Beijing to Putin's intelligence apparatus. So this is our intelligence. This is under the Biden administration.
Yeah.
We pass it to China. And then they pass it to Russia. And then China just, of course, spits in our face, and they claim, quote, that the U.S. was trying to sow discord and that China would not try to impede Russian plans and actions. And I got to tell you, bro, I no longer buy into the arguments of stupidity. I think people just willfully do things that are just bad.
I think the best possible interpretation of that I can think of, which I have no idea if this would even be close to being correct, is that maybe that was fed to China in the expectation that it would be relayed to Russia and that would somehow deter Russia.
That's what they say. And I'm sure that was, quote, the intention. But come on, there is so much available information, even open source, where tying it's with all due respect, the excuses have got to stop. And this is where I say each president in my lifetime is like ricocheting bullets. They'll do some good things, and then they cancel it out by doing 10 bad things.
Yeah, I guess what it comes down to me is the delusion that there is any real distance between China and Russia these days. I think they've been collaborating very closely together for decades, at the very least. Their interests are very aligned with each other. They're supporting each other. I think the conservatives who think they can somehow turn Russia against China are completely delusional. I think Brandon Weichert was one of the ones I can think of who really annoyed me by saying, oh, we should just let Russia have Ukraine and then we can use them against China. No, it's just not going to happen. And then the Democrats who somehow think that they can be anti-Russia but pro-China, as if they're not completely contradicting themselves that way, are delusional. And all this makes me think of the that stupid humanitarian aid bridge they built off the shore in Gaza that quickly fell apart. Oh, we're going to spend all this money to do something for some supposed humanitarian purpose, and then it's just immediately going to completely fall apart. And there's no substance to this. There's no grand strategy. There's no long-range thinking. There's nothing. Biden came in. Harris went completely along with him in lifting the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, pulling all U.S. personnel out of Ukraine when we thought Russia was going to invade. I mean, imagine if we had done that during the Cold War, right? Imagine we had intel that Russia was about to invade West Germany, and we said, oops, we better get all our forces out right away. What's the whole point of having our forces there in the first place? It's a tripwire defense. That's a trigger for us to respond to aggression. Biden didn't even do that. He said, oh, no, get them all out now. Everybody out. Just like in Afghanistan. All these things that he did to show weakness, saying, oh, well, if Russia does a little limited incursion, then maybe we won't respond. That reminds me of the speech somebody made. Was it Atchison about South Korea not being within our defense perimeter right before the Korean War? And the Soviets said, oh, okay, great, let's invade. Going back to Radchenko apparently dug up the documents from the Soviets about, why they really invaded Korea. Apparently, they intercepted some statements from MacArthur saying that MacArthur didn't think we would respond to an invasion of South Korea. They said, okay, great. If MacArthur says that, then let's go for it. You just can't say things like that if you're in that high a position of leadership. Biden said it. Harris went along with it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like Harris has been saying, oh, Biden's wrong about anything.
No, of course not. Not
She's
publicly,
been,
at least.
yeah, she's been the most loyal, in public, slavish devotee. And then on top of that, apparently she can't keep anyone on her staff. She's had like 90% staff turnover since she became vice president.
Well, she's supposedly a horror to work for. She's extremely difficult from what I've heard, and well, not heard, but read at least, supposedly. No, I mean, it's not a good situation what we're faced with. And, look, I mean, part of the job of the show is to call balls and strikes. And just because I might agree with people on certain things, I'm not going to overlook other things.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would just be bad analysis on either camp. And I got to tell you, and this is where I'm kind of upset with the Republican Party, and they've really taken a really wrong direction on really examining not only Harris, but especially also Tim Walz. And where you have people like James A. Lindsay and Ann Coulter, for example, picking on Walz's son, Gus, for his reaction to his father. And I mean, really some disgusting things of picking on him because of his mental challenges, to the point where James A. Lindsay posted this book, How to Raise a Retarded Child, in response to, I mean, that, and also picking on the fact that Walz doesn't have any stocks or doesn't own large cash assets. So you have people like Ben Shapiro and various allied hedge funders claiming, oh, this is because he doesn't know how to manage money and he's financially illiterate. And that, again, plays into the Democratic campaign to show that, the Republicans are insensitive and elitist. Yeah, and I got to tell you, I've seen that up close and personal with Republicans down here in Palm Beach County. It's one of the things that and instead they should be going after Walz about what we were talking about, which is
those are surefire formulas for generating sympathy for the guy, and there's no reason why they should be doing that. If anything, they should be sympathizing with him. I wouldn't even bring it up, honestly. Somebody's children. I didn't like it when either side, either the Clintons or their opponents, brought up Chelsea Clinton when she was still a child. Once she's an adult, she's fair game. Turns out she's a vapid idiot, but at least she was actually saying things and volunteering herself into the public debate. I didn't like it when the Democrats tried to make an issue out of Barron Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He's a kid. Leave him the hell alone. He didn't ask for that. He didn't ask for this. It's his parents. Let him be a kid. Let him have his parents. That shouldn't be a public issue. So I'm certainly with you on that. And I try to think of things that I agree with my opponents on. For instance, I think Obama gave a great speech once about nuclear weapons and, how they really ideally ought to be abolished. I actually thought it was very Reagan-esque because Reagan was a nuclear abolitionist himself, even though he got portrayed as a warmonger, so much. I don't think we're ready for that. I don't think we're going to be ready anytime soon. But, that's something where I thought Obama was right about that. I thought he was right about gay marriage. I thought he was right to, not want to crack down on states that legalized marijuana and, send the feds in to prosecute everybody. For a long time, I was trying to think of something that I thought Biden was right about, and the only thing I could think of for a while was supporting Ukraine. And then I realized that, he wasn't really doing that either. With Harris, I'm stumped. I can't think of anything I agree with her about. I really can't. I wish I could.
Yeah. Well, yeah, my opinion on her, and I'll deal with it in my paper too as well, the balls, the strikes, which each and every one of them. My political traditions, I laid out presidents and senators that I agree with. There are more, but, that's where I'm at. I'm politically very eclectic, to be honest with you. I call for several things. Strong national defense while being very careful about hyper-interventionism and out of control, unaccountable, corrupt military-industrial complex, which, by the way, deals with China and companies tied to our military-industrial complex have dealt with Putin's Russia, like Boeing. They had a design center there and everything else. Forget it. So you need that. Strong national defense, but giving the left their due where they're right, where they have rightful concerns. And the additional point to that is when you take into account legitimate arguments with the other side, you also take the wind out of their sails.
Yeah.
You flank them. And a lot of people, I don't think even on our side, respectfully understand that strategy necessarily, because I think people are so emotional and politically tribalist.
Yeah.
Secondly, I'm for pre-Reagan capitalism. I don't hate rich people because they're rich. It's not an issue of how much money you have. It's how you make your money. And that's my area of concern. So I'm for pre-Reagan capitalism. And could do a whole show on that. I'm for a ceasefire in the culture wars. I think both sides have their legitimate points. I'd like to see Christians coexisting with the gays, with the Jews, with the non-radical Muslims or non-fundamentalist Muslims, the atheists, whatever. I think as long as we have common goals for a strong, protected United States, where there's what I term shared but earned prosperity. That's my slogan, shared but earned prosperity. Then that's going to transcend a lot of differences.
Mm-hmm.
I call it a coexistence of lifestyles or pluralism of lifestyles.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the pedophiles and other criminal elements, they obviously need to be marginalized and smashed to pieces.
Yeah.
But the other things, I do believe in a pluralism of lifestyles. You don't have people are not going to become better Christians or converted to the Christian faith well, Jews generally don't convert, or the Islamic faith, because you're going after the LGBTQ plus community or an atheist community. I think everyone can kind of coexist. And I also do believe in stronger families. And that needs to come through family-friendly economic policies. Um, and that's kind of my take on the issues. I am for strong unions, but ones that are non-communist. What the late Russell Kirk referred to, the fact that, quote, we need more genuinely educated trade union leaders and more genuine educated businessmen. And I agree with that. I think the education system needs to reflect reality. And that would include for high schoolers teaching real world economics, not academic economics, but actually the importance of labor, investors, property owners, and
Mm-hmm.
consumers.
Yeah.
I also appreciate the institutional and historical school of approach to economics. I
Mm-hmm.
also, I'm not a free market libertarian, but I'm also not a Marxist, and I'm not a fascist, autarkist, and corporatist
Right.
either. I'm more for the American school of economics. So people like Henry Carey, Abraham Lincoln, the old Whig Party, and the Republican Party up until the 1930s. I'm also more of a partial New Dealer, where it stabilized the financial system like Glass-Steagall and others. When it comes to academics and education, um, back to that, I am very skeptical of the school privatization movement. Even conservative and some libertarian publications have pointed out the corruptions involved with charter schools, for example. And there's also a national security issue where you have Turkish and Russian and Chinese investors buying these schools too as well, and using the EB-5 visa process too as well, and abusing it. That's a problem for me. Um, Whereas with colleges, I don't think everybody is for college. I think there's nothing wrong with federally funded trade schools. The
Yep.
George W. Bush administration cut those back tremendously, so did Reagan, and especially George W. Bush with No Child Left Behind. And that was a disaster.
Yeah.
Um,
Something I was thinking about since our last conversation, which is that one of my biggest problems with our education system today is the theory that it seems to operate on, that everyone needs to be routed into, going to college and getting a degree which will qualify them for a white collar job.
mhm.
I think that's just completely unrealistic. I don't think it's right for everybody, and it's resulted in this tremendous labor shortage we have now in the blue collar field that we're trying to make up for with immigrants. And I think immigration's great if you do it right, but we should be producing enough of our own blue collar workers that we're not completely dependent on importing that from outside the country. And even in areas with you know uh, relatively more advanced degrees, one thing that really bugged me was when people were talking about vaccination mandates to work in the healthcare field, which I never thought was a good idea. Uh, and they were saying, "Oh, it'll be fine if we don't have enough, qualified medical workers. We'll just import all the ones we want from the Philippines." And I thought, well, what about the Philippines? Don't they need healthcare workers too? You know, what makes them our go-to resource to just take all of their workers? I just don't think it's fair to anybody. Uh, you know, so I think that we have a lot of common ground in that area, certainly. I'm probably less enamored of the pre-1980 U.S. economy than you seem to be, but I don't necessarily think that the system we've had since then is all that ideal either. I think there's still some major problems with it, and even measures that I would have supported in theory, combined with other aspects of what was going on in the economy in a bad way. I think that we could probably do a whole show on what caused the housing crisis. But all I'll say right now, since it's relevant to Harris, is that California probably bears the biggest share of blame of any state in the country, I think, for the housing crisis, because of a bunch of factors that all combine together in California with the overall policy mix. And Harris, as far as I know, hasn't said anything right about that either.
Yeah, I mean, and a large part of the problem, and we'll do closing comments and whatnot. I mean, I'm not for price controls. I mean, price gouging legislation, I mean, we have that in most of the states, short of, I think, 8 states. I think that's a good thing. I think part of the problem, and I had a good conversation with a finance guy, Alberto Limas, on my last program, and he's really an expert on this, and I agree with him, and he has studied this, and he has worked for Goldman Sachs and others as a high-level trader and whatnot. And I think the problem is the incentives within the 1980s and post-1980s era capitalism is out of whack. It's become so financialized because that was taken as an article of faith for a variety of different reasons that, I mean, we can do a whole show on. And that's the one thing I liked about one of the major things I liked about the pre-1980s economy, even pre-Carter economy, because Carter started, things like clawing back anti-usury laws, like with the Monetary Control Act of 1980. Carter's thought of this total liberal, and in reality, and one of my political heroes, Scoop Jackson, the late senator from Washington, really butted heads with Carter and even tried to run against him in 1976 election. He felt that Carter was wrong on foreign policy. He was too much on the left on many issues, and he was too much on the pro-corporate neoliberal right on economics. But price controls, yeah, I've studied price controls about as practiced by the Axis powers, and let me tell you, they worked great. That's the end of this show. Have a good night. No, I'm kidding. Pre-April Fool's jokes. No, I mean, just study, when you have especially price controls, when they're carried out, especially by dictatorships, and those of you who are in favor of price controls, feel free to add in the comments if I'm wrong, if Tim and I are wrong. But I do know when you look at especially price controls as practiced by dictatorships, they have been an unmitigated disaster. You look at Greece in World War II, under the German occupation and the Greek puppet governments of the various generals like Sokologlu and others, it was a disaster. But they were fascists, basically, and they believe in that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think, I have no problem with anti-price gouging legislation, but I think you have to get to the core of the problem where you have many of these larger companies that are publicly traded that are all about maximizing shareholder value at all costs. And that's not necessarily, largely, they don't accomplish that through creating new products and new services. It's about extraction. It's about cutting back needlessly, even if the company is profitable and everything else. Mergers, acquisitions. What happens? People are fired, even though
it's all short-term, quarterly stuff for publicly traded corporations. I've been in startups that got acquired, and we went public essentially one way or the other, and it made a huge difference in how we operated as companies.
Exactly. So the issue, in my opinion, is not capitalism, and this is one of the biggest problems. You see, I agree. I like how the left, like the Richard Wolffs and others, how they who they talk about the system, how it operates today correctly, but the problem is their solutions are dreadful. Anybody who doesn't believe this, I mentioned this 1,001 times, and I will continue to do so. You look in the back of the manifest, the Communist Manifesto, and you look at what Karl Marx called for, and I know they'll say, well, he didn't intend this or anything else, but the fact of the matter is it's the program of the Communist League in Germany, and it was an outline of various policies, and most of those I disagree with intensely. They are against human nature. They're against, in my opinion, efficient and effective ways of running an economy. And also, there are parts of it that are slave-like or slavery-like, like the conscription of industrial armies, the despotic inroads into private property, the confiscation of rebels and immigrants, immigrant property, and things of that nature. I mean, it's some flagrantly authoritarian stuff. And that's why, really, honestly, I can't accept Marxist economic programs. Now, Richard Wolff, I'm sure you've listened to his works or his interviews, and he models himself more for the worker cooperatives and whatnot. But how would he achieve that? It would involve, if you get there, how would he achieve that? I don't think he has ever addressed, well, when capitalism falls, what happens? Is it just going to happen by osmosis? Is it going to happen by a paramilitary force of revolutionaries basically seizing these enterprises from the owners? I'm not sure about that. So it's just, he uses the Mondragon example, and that was formed cooperatively, granted with the help and tolerance of the Spanish government. So I'm a very, very deep skeptic of Marxists, if you will, in that respect. I will not have any of it. The biggest problem is, as you pointed out, this short-termism mentality. And that's really a lot of conservatives, and I think a lot of libertarians, except you, they hail that. Milton Friedman and Theodore Levitt and Jensen, I think it was Michael Jensen, I think, they were the authors of this worldview. And unfortunately, it really didn't serve us well. In a way, the theory on the surface makes sense. And, you know, I took Econ 1 and Econ 102. And I was more of a free market, hardcore libertarian then, but I remember walking away saying to myself, this was in the late 1990s, Professor Charles Register at Florida Atlantic University. He was a good professor, technique-wise, but the stuff didn't make sense. It was so counterintuitive and counter to really how the real world, business and labor and capitalism operated. There were some things I think, for example, like rational economic behavior. Like he gave the example, if you had $2,000 and you just blew it all at once on something you like, well, that was considered rational. I'm thinking to myself,